International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jessica. International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories, edited by William Patton. Section 14. The Fable of the Two Mandolin Players and the Willing Performer, by George Ade. A very attractive debutante knew two young men, who called on her every Thursday evening and brought their mandolins along. They were conventional young men, of the kind that you see wearing spring overcoats in the clothing advertisements. One was named Fred, and the other was Eustace. The mothers of the neighborhood often remarked, "What perfect manners Fred and Eustace have!" Merely as an aside, it may be added that Fred and Eustace were more popular with the mothers than they were with the younger set, although no one could say a word against either of them. Only it was rumored in keen society that they didn't belong. The fact that they went calling in a crowd and took their mandolins along may give the acute reader some idea of the life that Fred and Eustace held out to the young women of their acquaintance. The debutante's name was Myrtle. Her parents were very watchful, and did not encourage her to receive callers, except such as were known to be exemplary young men. Fred and Eustace were a few of those who escaped the blacklist. Myrtle always appeared to be glad to see them, and they regarded her as a darned swell girl. Fred's cousin came from St. Paul on a visit, and one day, in the street, he saw Myrtle, and noticed that Fred tipped his hat and gave her a stage smile. "O Queen of Sheba!" exclaimed the cousin from St. Paul, whose name was Gus, as he stood stock-still and watched Myrtle's reversible plaid disappear around a corner. "She's a bird. Do you know her well?" "I know her quite well," replied Fred coldly. "She is a charming girl." "She is all of that. You're a great describer. And now what night are you going to take me round to call on her?" Fred very naturally hemmed and hawed. It must be remembered that Myrtle was a member of an excellent family, and had been schooled in the proprieties, and it was not to be supposed that she would crave the society of slangy old Gus, who had an abounding nerve, and furthermore was as fresh as the mountain air. He was the kind of fellow who would see a girl twice, and then, upon meeting her the third time, he would go up and straighten her cravat for her, and call her by her first name. Put him into a strange company, en route to a picnic, and by the time the baskets were unpacked he would have a blonde all to himself, and she would have traded her fan for his college pin. If a fair looker on the street happened to glance at him hard, he would run up and seize her by the hand, and convince her that they had met, and he always got away with it, too. In a department store, while awaiting for the cash boy to come back with the change, he would find out the girl's name, her favorite flower, and where a letter would reach her. Upon entering a parlor car at St. Paul, he would select a chair next to the most promising one in sight, and ask her if she cared to have the shade lowered. Before the train cleared the yards, he would have the porter bringing a footstool for the lady. At Hastings he would be asking her if she wanted something to read. At Red Wing he would be telling her that she resembled Maxine Elliott, and showing her his watch left to him by his grandfather, a prominent Virginian. At La Crosse he would be reading the menu card to her, and telling her how different it is when you have someone to join you in a bite. At Milwaukee he would go out and buy a bouquet for her, and when they rode into Chicago they would be looking but of the same window, and he would be arranging for her baggage with the transfer man. After that they would be old friends. Now, Fred and Eustace had been at school with Gus, and they had seen his work, and they were not disposed to introduce him into one of the most exclusive homes in the city. They had known Myrtle for many years, but they did not dare to address her by her first name, and they were positive that if Gus attempted any of his usual tactics with her, she would be offended, and naturally enough they would be blamed for bringing him to the house. But Gus insisted. He said he had seen Myrtle, and she suited him from the ground up, and he proposed to have friendly doings with her. At last they told him they would take him if he promised to behave. Fred warned him that Myrtle would frown down any attempt to be familiar on short acquaintance, and Eustace said that as long as he had known Myrtle he had never presumed to be free and forward with her. He had simply played the mandolin. That was as far along as he had ever got. Gus told them not to worry about him. All he asked was a start. He said he was a willing performer, but as yet he never had been disqualified for crowding. Fred and Eustace took this to mean that he would not overplay his attentions, so they escorted him to the house. As soon as he had been presented, Gus showed her where to sit on the sofa, Then he placed himself about 6 inches away and began to buzz, looking her straight in the eye. He said that when he first saw her he mistook her for Miss Prentice, who was said to be the most beautiful girl in St. Paul. Only, when he came closer, he saw that it couldn't be Miss Prentice, because Miss Prentice didn't have such lovely hair. Then he asked her the month of her birth and told her fortune, thereby coming nearer to holding her hand within 8 minutes than Eustace had come in a lifetime. "Play something, boys," he ordered, just as if he had paid them money to come along and make music for him. They unlimbered their mandolins and began to play a Sousa march. He asked Myrtle if she had seen the new moon. She replied that she had not, so they went outside. When Fred and Eustace finished the first piece, Gus appeared at the open window and asked them to play the Georgia Camp Meeting, which had always been one of his favorites. So they played that, and when they had concluded there came a voice from the outer darkness, and it was the voice of Myrtle. She said, "I'll tell you what to play. Play the intermezzo." Fred and Eustace exchanged glances. They began to perceive that they had been backed into a siding. With a few potted palms in front of them, and 2 cards from the Union, they would have been just the same as a hired orchestra. But they played the intermezzo and felt peevish. Then they went to the window and looked out. Gus and Myrtle were sitting in the hammock, which had quite a pitch toward the center. Gus had braced himself by holding to the back of the hammock. He did not have his arm around Myrtle, but he had it extended in a line parallel with her back. What he had done wouldn't justify a girl in saying, "Sir!" but it started a real scandal with Fred and Eustace. They saw that the only way to get even with her was to go home without saying good night, so they slipped out the side door, shivering with indignation. After that, for several weeks, Gus kept Myrtle so busy that she had no time to think of considering other candidates. He sent books to her mother and allowed the old gentleman to take chips away from him at poker. They were married in the autumn, and father-in-law took Gus into the firm, saying that he had needed a good pusher for a long time. At the wedding, the 2 mandolin players were permitted to act as ushers. Moral: to get a fair trial of speed, use a pacemaker. End of section 14.
International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mina Anderson. International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories, edited by William Patton. Section 15. The Fable of the Preacher Who Flew His Kite, but Not Because He Wished to Do So, by George Ade. A certain preacher became wise to the fact that he was not making a hit with his congregation. The parishioners did not seem inclined to seek him out after services and tell him he was a pansy. He suspected that they were rapping him on the quiet. The preacher knew there must be something wrong with his talk. He had been trying to expound in a clear and straightforward manner, omitting foreign quotations, setting up for illustration of his points such historical characters as were familiar to his hearers, putting the stubby old English words ahead of the Latin, and rather flying low along the intellectual plane of the aggregation that chipped in to pay his salary. But the pew holders were not tickled. They could understand everything he said, and they began to think he was common. So he studied the situation and decided that if he wanted to win them and make everybody believe he was a nobby and boss minister, he would have to hand out a little guff. He fixed it up good and plenty. On the following Sunday morning, he got up in the lookout and read a text that didn't mean anything, read from either direction, and then he sized up his flock with a dreamy eye and said, "We cannot more adequately voice the poetry and mysticism of our text than in those familiar lines of the great Icelandic poet, Ekon Navroik. To hold is not to have, under the seared firmament, where chaos sweeps, and vast futility sneers at these puny aspirations. There is the full reprisal." When the preacher concluded this extract from the well-known Icelandic poet, he paused and looked downward. breathing heavily upon his nose, like Camille in the third act. A stout woman in the front row put on her eyeglasses and leaned forward so as not to miss anything. A venerable harness dealer over at the right nodded his head solemnly. He seemed to recognize the quotation. Members of the congregation glanced at one another as if to say, "This is certainly hot stuff." The preacher wiped his brow and said he had no doubt that every one within the sound of his voice remembered what Quarolius had said, following the same line of thought. It was Quarolius who disputed the contention of the great Persian theologian Ramtazuk, that the soul in its reaching out after the unknowable was guided by the spiritual genesis of motive rather than by mere impulse of mentality. The preacher didn't know what all this meant, and he didn't care, but you can rest easy that the pew holders were on in a minute. He talked it off in just the way that Cyrano talks when he gets Roxanne so dizzy that she nearly falls off the piazza. The parishioners bit their lower lips and hungered for more first-class language. They had paid their money for tall talk, and were prepared to solve any and all styles of delivery. They held on to the cushions and seemed to be having a nice time. The preacher quoted copiously from the great poet Amebius. He recited 18 lines of Greek and then said, "How true this is," and not a parishioner batted an eye. It was Amebius whose immortal lines he recited in order to prove the extreme error of the position assumed in the controversy by the famous Italian Polenta. He had them going, and there wasn't a thing to it. When he would get tired of faking philosophy, he would quote from a celebrated poet of Ecuador or Tasmania or some other seaport town. Compared with this verse, all of which was the same school as the Icelandic masterpiece, the most obscure and clouded passage in Robert Browning was like a plate glass front in a State Street candy store, just after the colored boy gets through using the chamois. After that he became eloquent, and began to get rid of long Boston words that hadn't been used before that season. He grabbed a rhetorical Roman candle in each hand, and you couldn't see him for the sparks, after which he sank his voice to a whisper and talked about the birds and the flowers. Then, although there was no cue for him to weep, he shed a few real tears, and there wasn't a dry glove in the church. After he sat down, he could tell by the scared look of the people in front that he had made a 10 strike. Did they give him the joyous palm that day? Sure. The stout lady could not control her feelings when she told him how much the sermon had helped her. The venerable harness dealer said he wished to endorse the able and scholarly criticism of Polenta. In fact, everyone said that the sermon was superfine and dandy. The only thing that worried the congregation was the fear that if it wished to retain such a whale, it might have to boost his salary. In the meantime, the preacher waited for someone to come and ask about Polenta, Amebius, Ramtazuk, Quarolius, and the great Icelandic poet Navroik. But no one had the face to step up and confess his ignorance of these celebrities. The pew holders didn't even admit among themselves that the preacher had rung in some new ones. They stood pat and merely said it was an elegant sermon. Perceiving that they would stand for anything, the preacher knew what to do after that. Moral: give the people what they think they want. The Shadows on the Wall by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. "Henry had words with Edward in the study the night before Edward died," said Caroline Glynn. She was elderly, tall, and harshly thin, with a hard colorlessness of face. She spoke not with acrimony, but with grave severity. Rebecca Ann Glynn, younger, stouter, and rosy of face between her crinkling puffs of gray hair, gasped, by way of assent. She sat in a white flounce of black silk in the corner of the sofa, and rolled terrified eyes from her sister Caroline to her sister Mrs. Stephen Brigham, who had been Emma Glynn, the one beauty of the family. She was beautiful still, with a large, splendid, full-blown beauty. She filled a great rocking chair with her superb bulk of femininity and swayed gently back and forth, her black silks whispering and her black frills fluttering. Even the shock of death, for her brother Edward lay dead in the house, could not disturb her outward serenity of demeanour. She was grieved over the loss of her brother. He had been the youngest, and she had been fond of him. But never had Emma Brigham lost sight of her own importance amidst the waters of tribulation. She was always awake to the consciousness of her own stability in the midst of vicissitudes and the splendour of her permanent bearing. But even her expression of masterly placidity changed before her sister Caroline's announcement and her sister Rebecca Ann's gasp of terror and distress in response. "I think Henry might have controlled his temper when poor Edward was so near his end," said she with an asperity which disturbed slightly the roseate curves of her beautiful mouth. "Of course he did not know," murmured Rebecca Ann in a faint tone strangely out of keeping with her appearance. One involuntarily looked again to be sure that such a feeble pipe came from that full swelling chest. "Of course he did not know it," said Caroline quickly. She turned on her sister with a strange sharp look of suspicion. "How could he have known it?" said she. Then she shrank as if from the other's possible answer. "Of course, you and I both know that he could not," said she conclusively, but her pale face was paler than it had been before. Rebecca gasped again. The married sister, Mrs. Emma Brigham, was now sitting up straight in her chair. She had ceased rocking, and was eyeing them both intently, with a sudden accentuation of family likeness in her face. Given one common intensity of emotion, and similar lines showed forth, and the three sisters of one race were evident. "What do you mean?" said she, impartial to them both. Then she too seemed to shrink before a possible answer. She even laughed an evasive sort of laugh. "I guess you don't mean anything," said she. But her face wore still the expression of shrinking horror. "Nobody means anything," said Caroline firmly. She rose and crossed the room toward the door with grim decisiveness. "Where are you going?" asked Mrs. Brigham. "I have something to see," replied Caroline, and the others at once knew by her tone that she had some solemn and sad duty to perform in the chamber of death. "Oh," said Mrs. Brigham. After the door had closed behind Caroline, she turned to Rebecca. "Did Henry have many words with him?" she asked. "They were talking very loud," replied Rebecca evasively, yet with an answering gleam of ready response to the other's curiosity in the quick lift of her soft blue eyes. Mrs. Brigham looked at her. She had not resumed rocking. She still sat up straight with a slight knit of intensity on her fair forehead, between the pretty rippling curves of her auburn hair. "Did you hear anything?" she asked in a low voice with a glance toward the door. "I was just across the hall in the south parlour, and that door was open and this door ajar," replied Rebecca with a slight flush. "Then you must have." "I couldn't help it." "Everything?" "Most of it." "What was it?" "The old story. I suppose Henry was mad, as he always was, because Edward was living on here for nothing when he had wasted all the money father left him." Rebecca nodded with a fearful glance at the door. When Emma spoke again, her voice was still more hushed. "I know how he felt," said she. "He had always been so prudent himself, and worked hard at his profession, and there Edward had never done anything but spend, and it must have looked to him as if Edward was living at his expense, but he wasn't. No, he wasn't. It was the way father left the property, that all the children should have a home here, and he left money enough to buy the food and all, if we had all come home. Yes, and Edward had a right here according to the terms of father's will, and Henry ought to have remembered it. Yes, he ought." "Did he say hard things?" "Pretty hard from what I heard." "What?" "I heard him tell Edward that he had no business here at all, and he thought he had better go away." "What did Edward say?" "That he would stay here as long as he lived, and afterward too, if he had a mind to, and he would like to see Henry get him out, and then—" "What?" "Then he laughed." "What did Henry say?" "I didn't hear him say anything, but—" But what? I saw him when he came out of this room. He looked mad? You've seen him when he looked so. Emma nodded. The expression of horror on her face had deepened. Do you remember that time he killed the cat because she had scratched him? Yes. Don't! Then Caroline re-entered the room. She went up to the stove in which a wood fire was burning. It was a cold, gloomy day of fall, and she warmed her hands, which were reddened from recent washing in cold water. Mrs. Brigham looked at her and hesitated. She glanced at the door, which was still ajar, as it did not easily shut, being still swollen with the damp weather of the summer. She rose and pushed it together with a sharp thud, which jarred the house. Rebecca started painfully with a half exclamation. Caroline looked at her disapprovingly. "It's time you controlled your nerves, Rebecca," said she. "I can't help it," replied Rebecca with almost a wail. "I am nervous. There's enough to make me so, the Lord knows." "What do you mean by that?" asked Caroline, with her old air of sharp suspicion, and something between challenge and dread of its being met. Rebecca shrank. "Nothing," said she. "Then I wouldn't keep speaking in such a fashion." Emma, returning from the closed door, said impetuously that it ought to be fixed. It shut so hard. "It will shrink enough after we have had the fire a few days," replied Caroline. "If anything is done to it, it will be too small. There will be a crack at the sill." "I think Henry ought to be ashamed of himself for talking as he did to Edward," said Mrs. Brigham abruptly, but in an almost inaudible voice. "Hush!" said Caroline, with a glance of actual fear at the closed door. "Nobody can hear with the door shut." "He must have heard it shut, and I can't say. I can say what I want to before he comes down, and I am not afraid of him." "I don't know who is afraid of him. What reason is there for anybody to be afraid of Henry?" demanded Caroline. Mrs. Brigham trembled before her sister's look. Rebecca gasped again. "There isn't any reason, of course. Why should there be?" "I wouldn't speak so then. Somebody might overhear you and think it was queer. Miranda Joy is in the south parlor, sewing, you know." "I thought she went upstairs to stitch on the machine." "She did, but she has come down again." "Well, she can't hear." "I say again, I think Henry ought to be ashamed of himself. I shouldn't think he'd ever get over it, having words with poor Edward the very night before he died. Edward was enough sight better disposition than Henry, with all his faults. I always thought a great deal of poor Edward myself." Mrs. Brigham passed a large fluff of handkerchief across her face. Rebecca sobbed outright. "Rebecca!" said Caroline admonishingly, keeping her mouth stiff and swallowing determinately. "I've never heard him speak a cross word, unless he spoke cross to Henry that last night. I don't know, but he did, from what Rebecca overheard," said Emma. "Not so much cross as sort of soft and sweet and aggravating," sniffled Rebecca. "He never raised his voice," said Caroline, "but he had his way. He had a right to in this case." "Yes, he did. He had as much of a right here as Henry," sobbed Rebecca. "And now he's gone, and he will never be in this home that poor father left him and the rest of us again." "What do you really think ailed Edward?" asked Emma in hardly more than a whisper. She did not look at her sister. Caroline sat down in a nearby armchair and clutched the arms convulsively until her thin knuckles whitened. "I told you," said she. Rebecca held her handkerchief over her mouth and looked at them above it with terrified, streaming eyes. "I know you said that he had terrible pains in his stomach and had spasms, but what do you think made him have them?" "Henry called it gastric trouble. You know Edward has always had dyspepsia." Mrs. Brigham hesitated a moment. "Was there any talk of an examination?" said she. Then Caroline turned on her fiercely. "No!" said she in a terrible voice. "No!" The three sisters' souls seemed to meet on one common ground of terrified understanding through their eyes. The old-fashioned latch of the door was heard to rattle, and a push from without made the door shake ineffectually. "It's Henry," Rebecca sighed rather than whispered. Mrs. Brigham settled herself after a noiseless rush across the floor into her rocking chair again, and was swaying back and forth with her head comfortably leaning back, when the door at last yielded and Henry Glynn entered. He cast a covertly sharp, comprehensive glance at Mrs. Brigham with her elaborate calm, at Rebecca quietly huddled in the corner of the sofa with her handkerchief to her face and only one small reddened ear as attentive as a dog's uncovered and revealing her alertness for his presence, at Caroline sitting with a strained composure in her armchair by the stove. She met his eyes quite firmly with a look of inscrutable fear and defiance of the fear and of him. Henry Glynn looked more like this sister than the others. Both had the same hard delicacy of form and feature. Both were tall and almost emaciated. Both had a sparse growth of gray blonde hair far back from high intellectual foreheads. Both had an almost noble aquilinity of feature. They confronted each other with the pitiless immovability of two statues in whose marble lineaments emotions were fixed for all eternity. Then Henry Glynn smiled, and the smile transformed his face. He looked suddenly years younger, and an almost boyish recklessness and irresolution appeared in his face. He flung himself into a chair, with a gesture which was bewildering from its incongruity with his general appearance. He leaned his head back, flung one leg over the other, and looked laughingly at Mrs. Brigham. "I declare, Emma, you look younger every year," he said. She flushed a little, and her placid mouth widened at the corners. She was susceptible to praise. "Our thoughts today ought to belong to the one of us who will never grow older," said Caroline in a hard voice. Henry looked at her, still smiling. "Of course, we none of us forget that," said he in a deep, gentle voice. "But we have to speak to the living, Caroline, and I have not seen Emma for a long time, and the living are as dear as the dead." "Not to me," said Caroline. She rose and went abruptly out of the room again. Rebecca also rose and hurried after her, sobbing loudly. Henry looked slowly after them. "Caroline is completely unstrung," said he. Mrs. Brigham rocked. A confidence in him, inspired by his manner, was stealing over her. Out of that confidence she spoke quite easily and naturally. "His death was very sudden," said she. Henry's eyelids quivered slightly, but his gaze was unswerving. "Yes," said he, "it was very sudden. He was sick only a few hours." "What did you call it?" "Gastric." "You did not think of an examination?" "There was no need. I am perfectly certain as to the cause of his death." Suddenly Mrs. Brigham felt a creep as of some live horror over her very soul. Her flesh prickled with cold before an inflection of his voice. She rose, tottering on weak knees. "Where are you going?" asked Henry in a strange, breathless voice. Mrs. Brigham said something incoherent about some sewing which she had to do, some black for the funeral, and was out of the room. She went up to the front chamber which she occupied. Caroline was there. She went close to her and took her hands, and the two sisters looked at each other. "Don't speak. Don't. I won't have it," said Caroline finally in an awful whisper. "I won't," replied Emma. That afternoon the three sisters were in the study, the large front room on the ground floor across the hall from the south parlor, where the dusk deepened. Mrs. Brigham was hemming some black material. She sat close to the west window for the waning light. At last she laid her work on her lap. "It's no use. I cannot see to sew another stitch until we have a light," said she. Caroline, who was writing some letters at the table, turned to Rebecca, in her usual place on the sofa. "Rebecca, you had better get a lamp," she said. Rebecca started up. Even in the dusk her face showed her agitation. "It doesn't seem to me that we need a lamp quite yet," she said in a piteous, pleading voice like a child's. "Yes, we do," returned Mrs. Brigham peremptorily. "We must have a light. I must finish this to-night, or I can't go to the funeral, and I can't see to sew another stitch." "Caroline can see to write letters, and she is farther from the window than you are," said Rebecca. "Are you trying to save kerosene, or are you lazy, Rebecca Glynn?" cried Mrs. Brigham. "I can go and get the light myself, but I have this work all in my lap." Caroline's pen stopped scratching. "Rebecca, we must have the light," said she. "Had we better have it in here?" asked Rebecca weakly. "Of course! Why not?" cried Caroline sternly. "I am sure I don't want to take my sewing into the other room when it's all cleaned up for tomorrow," said Mrs. Brigham. Why, I never heard such a to-do about lighting a lamp. Rebecca rose and left the room. Presently she entered with a lamp, a large one with a white porcelain shade. She set it on a table, an old-fashioned card table which was placed against the opposite wall from the window. The wall was clear of bookcases and books, which were only on 3 sides of the room. That opposite wall was taken up with 3 doors, the one small space being occupied by the table. Above the table on the old-fashioned paper, of a white satin gloss, traversed by an indeterminate green scroll, hung quite high a small gilt and black framed ivory miniature, taken in her girlhood, of the mother of the family. When the lamp was set on the table beneath it, the tiny pretty face painted on the ivory seemed to gleam out with a look of intelligence. "What have you put that lamp over there for?" asked Mrs. Brigham, with more of impatience than her voice usually revealed. "Why didn't you set it up in the hall and have done with it? Neither Caroline nor I can see if it is on that table." "I thought perhaps you would move," replied Rebecca hoarsely. "If I do move, we can't both sit at that table. Caroline has her paper all spread around. Why don't you set the lamp on the study table in the middle of the room? Then we can both see." Rebecca hesitated. Her face was very pale. She looked with an appeal that was fairly agonizing at her sister Caroline. "Why don't you put the lamp on this table, as she says?" asked Caroline, almost fiercely. "Why do you act so, Rebecca?" "I should think you would ask her that," said Mrs. Brigham. "She doesn't act like herself at all." Rebecca took the lamp and set it on the table in the middle of the room without another word. Then she turned her back upon it quickly, and seated herself on the sofa, and placed a hand over her eyes, as if to shade them, and remained so. "Does the light hurt your eyes, and is that the reason why you didn't want the lamp?" asked Mrs. Brigham kindly. "I always like to sit in the dark," replied Rebecca chokingly. Then she snatched her handkerchief hastily from her pocket and began to weep. Caroline continued to write, Mrs. Brigham to sew. Suddenly Mrs. Brigham, as she sewed, glanced at the opposite wall. The glance became a steady stare. She looked intently, her work suspended in her hands. Then she looked away again and took a few more stitches. Then she looked again, and again turned to her task. At last she laid her work in her lap and stared concentratedly. She looked from the wall around the room, taking note of the various objects. She looked at the wall long and intently. Then she turned to her sisters. "What is that?" said she. "What?" asked Caroline harshly. Her pen scratched loudly across the paper. Rebecca gave one of her convulsive gasps. "That strange shadow on the wall," replied Mrs. Brigham. Rebecca sat with her face hidden. Caroline dipped her pen in the inkstand. "Why don't you turn around and look?" asked Mrs. Brigham in a wondering and somewhat aggrieved way. "I am in a hurry to finish this letter if Mrs. Wilson Ebbett is going to get word in time to come to the funeral," replied Caroline shortly. Mrs. Brigham rose, her work slipping to the floor, and she began walking around the room, moving various articles of furniture, with her eyes on the shadow. Then suddenly she shrieked out, "Look at this awful shadow! What is it? Caroline, look! Look! Rebecca, look! What is it?" All Mrs. Brigham's triumphant placidity was gone. Her handsome face was livid with horror. She stood stiffly, pointing at the shadow. "Look!" said she, pointing her finger at it. "Look! What is it?" Then Rebecca burst out in a wild wail, after a shuddering glance at the wall. "Oh, Caroline, there it is again! There it is again!" "Caroline Glynn, you look!" said Mrs. Brigham. "Look! What is that dreadful shadow?" Caroline rose, turned, and stood confronting the wall. "How should I know?" she said. "It has been there every night since he died," cried Rebecca. "Every night?" "Yes. He died Thursday, and this is Saturday. That makes 3 nights," said Caroline rigidly. She stood as if holding herself calm, with a vise of concentrated will. It looks like," stammered Mrs. Brigham in a tone of intense horror. "I know what it looks like well enough," said Caroline. "I've got eyes in my head." It looks like Edward, burst out Rebecca in a sort of frenzy of fear. Only— Yes, it does, assented Mrs. Brigham, whose horror-stricken tone matched her sister's. Only— Oh, it is awful! What is it, Caroline? I ask you again, how should I know? Replied Caroline. I see it there like you. How should I know any more than you? It must be something in the room, said Mrs. Brigham, staring wildly around. We moved everything in the room the first night it came, said Rebecca. It is not anything in the room. Caroline turned upon her with a sort of fury. Of course it is something in the room, said she. How you act! What do you mean by talking so? Of course it is something in the room. Of course it is, agreed Mrs. Brigham, looking at Caroline suspiciously. Of course it must be. It is only a coincidence. It just happens so. Perhaps it is that fold of the window curtain that makes it. It must be something in the room. It is not anything in the room, repeated Rebecca with obstinate horror. The door opened suddenly, and Henry Glynn entered. He began to speak, then his eyes followed the direction of the others. He stood stock still, staring at the shadow on the wall. It was life-size, and stretched across the white parallelogram of a door, half across the wall space on which the picture hung. What is that? He demanded in a strange voice. It must be due to something in the room, Mrs. Brigham said faintly. It is not due to anything in the room, said Rebecca again, with the shrill insistency of terror. How you act, Rebecca Glynn, said Caroline. Henry Glynn stood and stared a moment longer. His face showed a gamut of emotions, horror, conviction, then furious incredulity. Suddenly he began hastening hither and thither about the room. He moved the furniture with fierce jerks, turning ever to see the effect upon the shadow on the wall. Not a line of its terrible outlines wavered. It must be something in the room, he declared in a voice which seemed to snap like a lash. His face changed. The inmost secrecy of his nature seemed evident until one almost lost sight of his lineaments. Rebecca stood close to her sofa, regarding him with woeful, fascinated eyes. Mrs. Brigham clutched Caroline's hand. They both stood in a corner out of his way. For a few moments he raged about the room like a caged wild animal. He moved every piece of furniture. When the moving of a piece did not affect the shadow, he flung it to the floor, the sisters watching. Then suddenly he desisted. He laughed and began straightening the furniture which he had flung down. What an absurdity, he said easily. Such a to-do about a shadow. That's so, assented Mrs. Brigham in a scared voice which she tried to make natural. As she spoke, she lifted a chair near her. I think you have broken the chair that Edward was so fond of, said Caroline. Terror and wrath were struggling for expression on her face. Her mouth was set, her eyes shrinking. Henry lifted the chair with a show of anxiety. Just as good as ever, he said pleasantly. He laughed again, looking at his sisters. Did I scare you? He said. I should think you might be used to me by this time. You know my way of wanting to leap to the bottom of a mystery. And that shadow does look queer, like— and I thought if there was any way of accounting for it, I would like to without any delay. You don't seem to have succeeded, remarked Caroline dryly, with a slight glance at the wall. Henry's eyes followed hers, and he quivered perceptibly. Oh, there is no accounting for shadows, he said, and he laughed again. A man is a fool to try to account for shadows. Then the supper bell rang, and they all left the room. But Henry kept his back to the wall, as did indeed the others. Mrs. Brigham pressed close to Caroline as she crossed the hall. He looked like a demon, she breathed in her ear. Henry led the way with an alert motion like a boy. Rebecca brought up the rear. She could scarcely walk, her knees trembled so. I can't sit in that room again this evening, she whispered to Caroline after supper. Very well, we will sit in the south room, replied Caroline. I think we will sit in the south parlor, she said aloud. It isn't as damp as the study, and I have a cold. So they all sat in the south room with their sewing. Henry read the newspaper, his chair drawn close to the lamp on the table. About 9 o'clock he rose abruptly and crossed the hall to the study. The three sisters looked at one another. Mrs. Brigham rose, folded her rustling skirts compactly around her, and began tiptoeing toward the door. "What are you going to do?" inquired Rebecca agitatedly. "I am going to see what he is about," replied Mrs. Brigham cautiously. She pointed as she spoke to the study door across the hall. It was ajar. Henry had striven to pull it together behind him, but it had somehow swollen beyond the limit with curious speed. It was still ajar, and a streak of light showed from top to bottom. The hall lamp was not lit. "You had better stay where you are," said Caroline with guarded sharpness. "I am going to see," repeated Mrs. Brigham firmly. Then she folded her skirts so tightly that her bulk with its swelling curves was revealed in a black silk sheath, and she felt with a slow toddle across the hall to the study door. She stood there, her eye at the crack. In the south room Rebecca stopped sewing and sat watching with dilated eyes. Caroline sewed steadily. What Mrs. Brigham, standing at the crack in the study door, saw was this: Henry Glynn, evidently reasoning that the source of the strange shadow must be between the table on which the lamp stood and the wall, was making systematic passes and thrusts all over and through the intervening space with an old sword which had belonged to his father. Not an inch was left unpierced. He seemed to have divided the space into mathematical sections. He brandished the sword with a sort of cold fury and calculation. The blade gave out flashes of light. The shadow remained unmoved. Mrs. Brigham, watching, felt herself cold with horror. Finally Henry ceased and stood with the sword in hand and raised as if to strike, surveying the shadow on the wall threateningly. Mrs. Brigham toddled back across the hall and shut the south room door behind her before she related what she had seen. "He looked like a demon," she said again. "Have you got any of that old wine in the house, Caroline? I don't feel as if I could stand much more." Indeed, she looked overcome. Her handsome placid face was worn and strained and pale. "Yes, there's plenty," said Caroline. "You can have some when you go to bed." "I think we had all better take some," said Mrs. Brigham. "Oh, my God, Caroline, what?" "Don't ask and don't speak," said Caroline. "No, I am not going to," replied Mrs. Brigham. "But—" Rebecca moaned aloud. "What are you doing that for?" asked Caroline harshly. "Poor Edward!" returned Rebecca. "That is all you have to groan for," said Caroline. "There is nothing else." "I am going to bed," said Mrs. Brigham. "I shan't be able to be at the funeral if I don't." Soon the three sisters went to their chambers, and the south parlour was deserted. Caroline called to Henry in the study to put out the light before he came upstairs. They had been gone about an hour when he came into the room, bringing the lamp which had stood in the study. He set it on the table, and waited a few minutes, pacing up and down. His face was terrible. His fair complexion showed livid. His blue eyes seemed dark blanks of awful reflections. Then he took the lamp up and returned to the library. He set the lamp on the center table, and the shadow sprang out on the wall. Again he studied the furniture and moved it about, but deliberately, with none of his former frenzy. Nothing affected the shadow. Then he returned to the south room with the lamp and again waited. Again he returned to the study and placed the lamp on the table, and the shadow sprang out upon the wall. It was midnight before he went upstairs. Mrs. Brigham and the other sisters, who could not sleep, heard him. The next day was the funeral. That evening the family sat in the south room. Some relatives were with them. Nobody entered the study until Henry carried a lamp in there after the others had retired for the night. He saw again the shadow on the wall leap to an awful life before the light. The next morning at breakfast Henry Glynn announced that he had to go to the city for 3 days. The sisters looked at him with surprise. He very seldom left home, and just now his practice had been neglected on account of Edward's death. He was a physician. "How can you leave your patients now?" asked Mrs. Brigham wonderingly. "I don't know how to, but there is no other way," replied Henry easily. "I have had a telegram from Dr. Mitford." "Consultation?" inquired Mrs. Brigham. "I have business," replied Henry. Dr. Mitford was an old classmate of his who lived in a neighboring city and who occasionally called upon him in the case of a consultation. After he had gone, Mrs. Brigham said to Caroline that after all Henry had not said that he was going to consult with Dr. Mitford, and she thought it very strange. "Everything is very strange," said Rebecca with a shudder. "What do you mean?" inquired Caroline sharply. "Nothing," replied Rebecca. Nobody entered the library that day, nor the next, nor the next. The third day Henry was expected home, but he did not arrive, and the last train from the city had come. "I call it pretty queer work," said Mrs. Brigham. "The idea of a doctor leaving his patients for 3 days anyhow, at such a time as this. And I know he has some very sick ones, he said so. And the idea of a consultation lasting 3 days. There is no sense in it. And now he has not come. I don't understand it for my part." "I don't either," said Rebecca. They were all in the south parlor. There was no light in the study opposite, and the door was ajar. Presently Mrs. Brigham rose. She could not have told why. Something seemed to impel her, some will outside her own. She went out of the room, again wrapping her rustling skirts around that she might pass noiselessly, and began pushing at the swollen door of the study. "She has not got any lamp," said Rebecca in a shaking voice. Caroline, who was writing letters, rose again, took a lamp (there were 2 in the room), and followed her sister. Rebecca had risen, but she stood trembling, not venturing to follow. The door-bell rang, but the others did not hear it. It was on the south door, on the other side of the house from the study. Rebecca, after hesitating until the bell rang the second time, went to the door. She remembered that the servant was out. Caroline and her sister Emma entered the study. Caroline set the lamp on the table. They looked at the wall. "Oh, my God!" gasped Mrs. Brigham. There are 2 shadows!" The sisters stood clutching each other, staring at the awful things on the wall. Then Rebecca came in, staggering, with a telegram in her hand. "Here is telegram," she gasped. "Henry is dead." End of section 15.
International Short Stories Volume 1, American Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kay Hand. International Short Stories Volume 1, American Stories, edited by William Patton. Section 16. Major Perdue's Bargain, by Joel Chandler Harris. When next I had an opportunity to talk with Aunt Minervy Ann, she indulged in a hearty laugh before saying a word, and it was some time before she found her voice. "What is so funny today?" I inquired. "Me, sah, nothin' 'tall 'bout me, and 'tain't only today, nudder. Hit's every day since I been big enough fer to see myself in de Spring Branch. I laughed den, and I laugh now every time I see myself in my mind, ef I got any mind. I was talkin' ter Hamp last night and tellin' him how I start in ter tell you somethin' 'bout Marse Paul Conant shoulder, and den end up by tellin' you everything else I know but dat. Hamp low, he did, 'Dat ain't nothin', bekase when I ax you ter marry me, you start in and tell me 'bout a nigger girl 'cross dar in Jasper County, which she make promise fer ter marry a man, and she crossed her heart, and den when de time come she stood up and marry him and find out 'tain't de same man, but somebody what she ain't never see befo'. I 'spect dat's so, sah, bekase dey was sumpin like dat happen in Jasper County. You know de Waters fambly, dey keep de race horses. Well, sir, 'twas right on der plantation. Warren Waters tole me 'bout dat hisse'f. He was de hoss trainer, and he's right dar on de groun'. When de gal done married, she look up and holler, 'You ain't my husband, bekase I ain't make no promise fer ter marry you.' De man he laugh and say, 'Don't need no promise atter you done married.' Well, sah, dey say dat gal was skeered fer true. She sot on look in der fire. De man sot and look at her. She try ter slip out de do', and he slipped wid her. She walked out to'rds de big house, and he walked out wid her. She came back, and he come wid her. She run, and he run wid her. She cry, and he laugh at her. She dunner what to do. Bimeby she tuck a notion dat de man might be Ole Boy hisse'f, and she drap down on her knees and 'gun ter pray. Dis make de man restless, look like he frettin'. Den he 'gun ter shake like he havin' chill. Den he slipped down out'n de cheer. Down he went on his all fours. Den his clothes dropped off, and bless gracious, dar he was, a great big black shaggy dog wid a short chain round his neck. Some un flung a chunk of fire at him, and he ran out howlin'. Dat was de last dey seed on him, sir. Dey flung his clothes in de fire, and dey make a blaze dat come plumb out ter de top of chimbley stack. Dat what make me tell Hamp 'bout it, sir. He ax me fer ter marry him, and I wa'n't so mighty sho dat he wa'n't the ol' boy." "Well, that is queer if true," said I. "But how about Mr. Conant's crippled shoulder?" "Oh, it's de trufe, sah. Warren Waters told me dat out'n his own mouf, and he was right dar. I dunno but what de gal was some er his kinnery. I don't mind tellin' you dat 'bout Marse Paul, sir, but you mustn't let on 'bout it, because Marse Tumlin and Miss Vallie dey as ticious 'bout dat as dey kin be. I'd never git der forgiveness if dey knowed I was settin' down here tellin' 'bout dat. You know how 'twaz in dem days. De folks dat was de richest was de wussest off when de army come home from battlin'. I done told you 'bout Marse Tumlin. He ain't had nothin' in de roun' world but a whole passel er land and me and Miss Vallie. I don't count Hamp, because Hamp 'fuse to believe he free, twell he ramble 'roun' and find out de patter rollers ain't gwine to take him up. Dat how come I had ter sell ginger cakes and chicken pies dat time. De money made at dat ain't last long, because Marse Tumlin he been used ter rich vittles, and he went right down town and got in a bottle er chow chow and some olives and some sardines and some cheese, and you know yo'se'f, sah, dat money ain't goin' ter las' when you buy dat kind er doin's. Well, sah, we done mighty well whiles de money helt out. But 'tain't court week all de time, and when dat de case, money got ter come from some'ers else 'sides sellin' cakes and pies. Bimeby, Hamp he got work at de Liberty stable where dey hire out hosses and board 'em. I call it a hoss tavern, sah, but Hamp he 'low it's a Liberty stable. Anyhow, he got work dar, and dat sorter help out. Sometimes he'd growl because I tuck his money fer to help out my white folks, but when he got right mad I'd give Miss Vallie de wink, and she'd say, "Hampton, how'd you like ter have a little dram ternight? You look like you are tired." I could 'a' hugged her fer de way she done it, and she is dat cute. And den Hamp he grin and 'low, "I ain't honin' for it, Miss Vallie, but 'twon't do me no harm, and it may do me good." And den, sah, he'd set down, and atter he sorter warmed up wid de dram, he'd kinder roll his eyes and 'low, "Miss Vallie, she is a fine white 'oman." Well, sah, 'tain't long 'fo' we had dat nigger man trained, done trained, bless you soul. One day Miss Vallie had ter go 'cross town, and she went by de Liberty stable whar Hamp was at, leastways he seed her some'ers, and he come home dat night lookin' like he was feelin' bad. He 'fused ter talk. Bimeby, atter his supper, he say, "I seed Miss Vallie downtown terday. She was wid Miss Irene, and dat dar frock she had on look mighty shabby, I 'low. Well, it de best she got. She ain't got money like de Chippendales, and Miss Irene don't keer how folks' clothes look. She too much quality fer dat. Hamp say, 'Whyn't you take some of your money and make Miss Vallie git her nice frock?' I 'low, 'Whar I got any money?' Hamp he hit his pocket and say, 'You got it right here.' An' sho' 'nuff, sah, dat nigger man had roller money, mos' $20. Some hoss drovers had come 'long, and Hamp made dat money by trimmin' up de ol' mules dey had and makin' 'em look young. He's got de art der dat, sah, and dey paid him well. Dar was de money, but how was I gwine ter git it in Miss Vallie's hand? I can buy vittles and she not know whar dey come fum, but when it come ter buyin' frocks, well, sah, hit stumped me. Dey wa'n't but one way ter do it, and I done it. I make like I was mad. I tuck de money and went in de house, dar whar Miss Vallie was sewin' and mendin'. I went stompin' in, I did, and when I got in I started my tune. I 'low, ef de Perdues gwine ter go scandalizin' deyse'f by trottin' downtown in broad daylight wid all kinder frocks on der back, I gwine 'way from here, and I dunno but what I'll go anyhow. 'Tain't because dey's any lack er money, fer here de money right here." Wid dat I slammed it down on de table. "Dar, take dat and git you a frock dat'll make you look like sump'n when you go outside dis house. And whiles you're git sump'n fer ter put on your head." Whether it was by reason of a certain dramatic faculty inherent in her race that she was able to summon emotions at will, or whether it was a mere unconscious reproduction, I am not prepared to say. But certain it is that, in voice and gesture, in tone and attitude, and in a certain passionate earnestness of expression, Aunt Minervy Ann built up the whole scene before my eyes with such power that I seemed to have been present when it occurred. I felt as if she had conveyed me bodily into the room to become a witness of the episode. She went on, still with a frown on her face and a certain violence of tone and manner. "I whipped round de room a time or two, pickin' up de cheers and slammin' 'em down agin and knockin' things round like I was mad. Miss Vallie put her sewin' down and lay her hand on de money. She 'low, 'What's dis, Aunt Minervy Ann?' I said, "Hit's money, dat's what 'tis, nothin' but nasty stinkin' money. I wish dey wa'n't none in de worl' less'n I had a barful." She sort of fumble at de money wid her fingers. You don't know, sir, how white and purty and weak her hand looked ter me dat night. She low, "Aunt Minervy Ann, I can't take dis." I blaze out at her, "You don't hafter take it, you done got it. An' ef you don't keep it, I'll rake up every rag and scrap I got and leave dis place now. Now you des try me." Again Aunt Minervy Ann summoned to her aid the passion of a moment that had passed away, and again I had the queer experience of seeming to witness the whole scene. She continued: "Wid dat I whipped outer de room and outer de house and went and sot down dar in my house whar Hamp was at. Hamp, he low, 'What she say?' I say she ain't had time ter say nothin'. I come 'way from dar. He low, 'You ain't brung dat money back, is you?' I say, 'Does you think I'm a start naked fool?' He low, ''Case ef you is, I'll put it right sprang in de fire here.' Well, sir, I sot dar some little time, but eve'ything wuz so still in de house, bein's Marse Tumlin gone down town, dat I crope back en crope in fer ter see what Miss Vallie doin'. Well, sir, she wuz cryin', settin' dar cryin'. I low, 'Honey, is I say anything fer ter hurt yo' feelin's?' She blubber out, 'You know you ain't,' en den she cry good fashion. Des 'bout dat time who should come in but Marse Tumlin. He look at Miss Vallie, en den he look at me. He say, 'Valentine, what de matter?' I say, 'It's me. I'm de one. I made her cry. I done sump'n ter hurt her feelin's.' She low, ''Tain't so, en you know it. I'm des cryin' bekaze you too good ter me.' Well, sir, I had ter git outer der fer ter keep from chokin'. Marse Tumlin foller me out, en right dar on de porch he low, 'Minervy Ann, nex' time don't be so dam good to her.' I was doin' some snifflin' myse'f 'bout dat time, en I ain't keerin' what I say, so I stop en flung back at 'im, 'I'll be des as dam good to her as I please. I'm free.' Well, sir, stidder hittin' me, Marse Tumlin bust out laughin', en long atter dat he laugh eve'y time he look at me, des like sump'n was ticklin' 'im mighty nigh ter death. I 'speck he must er tole 'bout dat cussin' part, bekaze folks 'roun' here done got de idea dat I'm a sassy en bad tempered 'oman. Ef I had ter work fer my livin', suh, I boun' you I'd be a long time findin' a place. Atter dat, Hamp he got in de legislatur', en it sho wuz a money makin' place. Den we had eve'ything we wanted en mo', too, but bimeby de legislatur' gun out, en den dar we wuz, flat ez flounders, en de white folks don't want ter hire Hamp des 'kase he been to de legislatur'. But he got back in de Liberty stable atter so long a time, yet 'twa'n't what you might call a livin'. All dat time I hear Marse Tumlin talkin' ter Miss Vallie 'bout what he call his wil' lan'. He say he got 2,000 acres down dar in de Wiregrass, en ef he kin sell it he be mighty glad ter do so. Well, suh, one day, 'long to'rds night, a 2-hoss wagon druv in at de side gate en come in de back yard. Ol' Ben Sadler wuz drivin', en he low, 'Heyo, Minervy Ann, whar you want dese goods dropped at?' I say, 'Hello yourse'f, ef you want ter hello. What you got dar, en who does it b'long ter?' He low, 'Hit's good fer Major Tumlin, Perdue, en whar does you want 'em drapped at?' Well, sir, I didn't know what ter say, but I run en ax Miss Vallie, en she say put 'em out anywheres 'roun' dar, 'kase she dunner nothin' 'bout 'em. So ol' Ben Sadler he put 'em out, en when I come ter look at 'em, dey wuz a barrel er sump'n, en a keg er sump'n, en a box er sump'n. De barrel shuck like it might be molasses, en de keg shuck like it might be dram, en de box hefted like it might be terbarker. En sho 'nuff dat what dey wuz, a barrel er sorghum syrup, en a keg of peach brandy, en a box er plug terbarker. I say right den, en Miss Vallie, I'll tell you de same, dat Marse Tumlin done gone en swap off all his wil' lan'. But Miss Vallie she say no, he won't never think er seen a thing. But bless yo' soul, sir, she wa'n't nothin' but a school girl, you may say, en she don't know no more 'bout men folks dan what de weasel do. En den right 'pon ter top dat, here come a nigger boy leadin' a bobtail hoss. When I see dat, I des good ez know dat de wil' lan' done be swap off, bekaze Marse Tumlin ain't got nothin' fer ter buy all dem things wid. En I tell you right now, sir, I was rank mad, 'kase what we want wid any ol' bobtail hoss? De sorghum mought do, en de dram kin be put up wid, en de terbacker got some comfort in it. But what de name er goodness we gwine ter do wid a ol' hoss, when we ain't got hardly 'nuff vittles fer ter feed herse'f wid? Dat's what I ask Miss Vallie, en she say right pine blank she don't know. Well, suh, it's de Lord's trufe. I wuz dat mad I dunner what to say, and I wa'n't carin' nudder, 'cause I know how we had ter pinch and squeeze fer to git 'long in dis house. But I went 'bout gittin' supper, and by Hamp he come, and I told him 'bout the old bobtail hoss, and he went out and look at him. Atter a while here he come back laughin'. I say, 'You're well to laugh at dat old hoss.' He low, 'I ain't laughin' at de hoss, I'm laughin' at you. Gal, dat de finest hoss what ever put foot on de ground in dis town. Dat's Marse Paul Conant's trottin' hoss. He'll fetch $500 any day. What he doin' here?' I up and tole him all I knowed, and he shuck his head. He low, 'Gal, you lay low. Dey's sumpin in her behind all dat.' What Hamp say sorter make me put on my studyin' cap, but when you come ter look at it, sir, dey wa'n't nothin' 'tall fer me ter study 'bout. All I had ter do was ter try ter find out what was behime it, and let it go at dat. When Marse Tumlin come home ter supper, I knowed sump'n was de matter wid 'im. I knowed it by his looks, suh. It's sorter wid folks like 'tis wid chillun. Ef you keep yer sump'n 'bout 'em, you'll watch der motions, and ef you watch der motions dey don't hatter tell you when sump'n's de matter. He come in so easy, suh, dat Miss Vallie ain't hear 'im, but I hear de do squeak, and I knowed 'twaz him. We wuz talkin' and gwine at a mighty rate, and I knowed he done stopped ter lis'n. Miss Vallie, she low she 'speck somebody made 'im a present of dem dar things. I say, honey, don't play fool yo'se'f. Ain't nobody gwine ter do dat. Our folks ain't no more like dey useter was den crab apples is like plums. Dey done come ter pass dat whatsomever dey dit der han's on, dey 'fuse ter turn it loose. All un 'em 'cep' Marse Tumlin Perdue. Dey ain't no tellin' what he gun fer all dat trash. Trash! Hit's wuss'n trash. I wish you'd go out dar and look at dat ol' bobtail hoss. Why, dat ol' hoss was stove up long 'fore de war. By rights he ought ter be in de boneyard dis very minute. He won't be here 2 whole days 'fore you'll see de buzzards lined up out dar on de back fence waitin', and dey won't hatter wait long nudder. Ef dey send any corn here fer ter feed dat bagger bones wid, I'll parch on it and eat it myse'f 'fo' he shall have it. Ef anybody 'speck I'm gwine ter 'ten' ter dat ol' frame, dey're 'speckin' wid de wrong specks. I tell you dat right now." All dis time Marse Tumlin was standin' out in de hall listenin'. Miss Vallie talk mighty sweet 'bout it. She say, "Ef dey ain't nobody else ter 'ten' de hoss, reckon I kin do it." I low, "My life er me, honey, de nex' news you know you'll be hirin' out ter Liberty Stable." Well, sir, my talk 'gun ter git so hot dat Marse Tumlin des had ter make a fuss. He fumbled wid de do' knob, and den came walkin' down de hall, and by dat time I was in de dinin' room. I walk mighty light, because ef he say anything I want ter hear it. You can't call it eavesdroppin', suh. Hit look ter me dat 'twaz ez much my business ez 'twaz dern, and I ain't never got dat idee out'n my head down ter dis day. But Marse Tumlin ain't say nothin' 'cep' fer ter ax Miss Vallie ef she feelin' well and how everything was, but de minute I hear him open his mouf I knew he'd had trouble on his mind. I can't tell you how I knowed it, sir, but dar 'twaz. Looked like he tried to hide it, because he told a whole lot of funny tales 'bout folks, and 'twa'n't long before he had Miss Vallie laughin' fit ter kill. But he ain't fool me, suh. Bimeby Miss Vallie she come in de dinin' room fer ter look at her settin' a table, because fum a little girl she always like ter have de dishes fixed des so. She was sorter hummin' a chune like she ain't want ter talk, but I ain't let dat stan' in my way. I low, I wisht everybody was like dat Mr. Paul Conant. I bet you right now he been downtown dar all day makin' money hand over fist, des ez fast ez he kin rake it in. I know, 'cause I does his washin' and cleans up his room for him." Miss Vallie say, "Well, what of it? Money don't make him no better'n anybody else." I low, "Hit don't make him no worse, and den, 'sides dat, he ain't gwine ter let anybody swindle him." By that time I had to go out and fetch supper in, and 'tain't take me no time, because I was jest achin' fer ter hear how Marse Tumlin come by dem dar contraptions and contrivances. And I stayed in dar to wait on de table, which it ain't need no waitin' on. Atter while I low, "Marse Tumlin, I like ter ferget ter tell you, yo' things done come." He say, "What things, Minervy Ann?" I say, "Dem dar contraptions and dat dar bobtail hoss." He look mighty lean and hungry, de hoss do, but Hamp says dat's because he's a high bred hoss. He say dem ar high breed hosses won't take on no fat, no matter how much you feed ern. Marse Tumlin sorter drum on de table. Atter while he low, "Dey done come, is dey, Minervy Ann?" I say, "Yasser, dey er right now. Hamp puts it down dat hoss one er de gayliest creeturs what ever make a track in dis town." Well, sir, 'tain't no use to tell you what else was said, 'cause 'twa'n't much. I seed dat Marse Tumlin wa'n't gwine talk 'bout it, on account er bein' feared he'd hurt Miss Vallie's feelin's ef he tol' her Dat he done swap off all dat wild land fer dem ar things and dat ar bobtail hoss. Dat what he done. Yes, sir. I hear 'im say so afterwards. He swap it off ter Marse Paul Conant. I thank my Lord it come out all right, but it come mighty nigh bein' de ruination er de fambly." "How was that?" I inquired. "Dat what I'm gwine ter tell you, sir. Right atter supper dat night, Marse Tumlin say he got ter go down ter town fer ter see a man on some business, an' he ax me ef I won't stay in de house dar with Miss Vallie. 'Twa'n't no trouble ter me, bekaze I'd been on de place anyhow, an' so when I got de kitchen cleaned up an' de things put away, I went back in de house whar Miss Vallie was 'at Marse Tumlin was done gone. Miss Vallie, she sot at de table doin' some kinder rufflin', so I sot back agin de wall in one of dem dar high back cheers. What we said I'll never tell you, sir, bekaze I'm one er deze kinder folks who ain't no sooner set down an' git still dan dey goes ter noddin'. Dat's me. Set me down in a cheer, high back or low back, an' I'm done gone. I kin sit here on de step an' keep dese eyes wide awake ez a skeered rabbit, but set me down in a cheer, well, sir, I'd like ter see anybody keep me awake when dat's de case. Dar I sat in dat ar high back cheer, Miss Vallie rufflin' an' flutin' sump'n an' tryin' ter make me talk, an' my head rollin' 'roun' like my neck done broke. Bimeby, blam, blam, come on de do'. We got one er dem ar jinglin' bells now, sir, but in dem times we had a knocker, an' it soun' like de roof fallin' in. I like ter jumped out'n my skin. Miss Vallie dropped her conflutements an' low, 'What in de world? Aunt Minervy Ann, go to de do'.' Well, sir, I went, but I ain't had no heart in it, bekaze I ain't knowed who it might be, an' whar dey come from, an' what dey want. But I went. 'Twuz me er Miss Vallie, an' I wa'n't gwine ter let dat chile go, not at dat time er night, dough it wa'n't so mighty late. I opened de do' on de crack, I did, an' lo, who dat? Somebody make an answer, 'Is de Major in, Aunt Minervy Ann?' An' I knowed right den it was Marse Paul Conant, an' it come over me dat he had sump'n ter do wid sendin' dem der contraptions, mo' speshually dat ar bobtail hoss. An' den, too, sir, lots quicker'n I kin tell it, hit come over me dat he been axin' me lots 'bout Miss Vallie. All come 'cross my mind, suz, while I's pullin' de do' open. I 'low, I did, 'No, sah, Marse Tumlin gone down town fer ter look atter some business, but he sho ter come back terreckly. Won't you come in, sir, an' wait fer 'im?' He sorter flung his head back an' laugh, soft, an' say, 'I don't care ef I do, Aunt Minervy Ann.' I 'low, 'Walk right in de parlor, sir, an' I'll make a light 'mos' 'fo' you kin turn 'roun'.' He come in, he did, an' I lit de lamp, an' time I lit 'er she 'gun ter smoke. Well, sir, he tuck dat lamp, run de wick up an' down a time er two, an' dar she was, bright ez day. When I went back in de room whar Miss Vallie was at, she was stan'in' dar lookin' scared. She say, 'Who dat?' I 'low, 'Hit's Marse Paul Conant, dat's who 'tis.' She say, 'What he want?' I 'low, 'Nothin' much. He does come a courtin'. Better jump up an' not keep 'im waitin'.' Well, sir, you could 'a' knocked 'er down wid a fedder. She stood dar wid 'er hand on 'er throat, takin' short breafs, des like a little bird does when it flies in de winder an' doesn't know how ter fly out ag'in. Bimeby she say, 'Aunt Minervy Ann, you oughter be 'shamed er yo'se'f. I know dat man when I see 'im, an' dat's all.' I 'low, 'Honey, you know mighty well he ain't come callin'. But he wanter see Marse Tumlin, an' dey ain't nothin' fer ter hinder you from gwine in dar an' makin' 'im feel at home while he's waitin'.' She sorter study a while, den she blush up. She say I dunno whedder I oughter. Well, sir, dat settled it. I knowed by de way she look an' talk dat she don't need no more swaddin'. I say, 'All right, honey, do ez you please, but it's yo' house an' you're de mist'ess, an' it'll look mighty funny ef dat young man got ter set in dar by hisse'f an' look at de wall while he waitin' fer Marse Tumlin.' I dunno whar he say, 'kase I ain't never hear 'im talk 'bout nobody. But I know mighty well he'll do a heap er thinkin'. Des like I tell you, suh, she skipped 'roun' dar an' flung on her Sunday frock, shuck out her curls, an' sorter fumble 'roun' wid some ribbons, an' dar she was, lookin' des ez fine ez a fiddle, ef not finer. Den she swep inter de parlor, an' you mayn't b'lieve it, suh, but she mighty nigh tuck de man's breff 'way. Mon, she was purty, an' she ain't done no mo' like dese everyday girls done nothin'. When she start 'way fum me, she was a gal. By de time she walk up de hall an' sweep in dat parlor, she was a grown 'oman. De blush what she had on at fust stayed wid 'er an' look like it wuz nat'ral color, an' her eyes shined, suh, like she had fire in 'em. I peeped at 'er, suh, fum behime de curtains in de settin' room, an' I know what I'm talkin' 'bout. It's de Lord's trufe, suh. Ef de men folks could tote derse'fs wid de wimmen an' do one way whiles dey feelin' anudder way, dey wouldn't be livin' in de world. You take a school gal, suh, an' she kin fool de smartest man what ever trod de shoe leather. He may talk wid 'er all day an' half de night, an' he never is ter fin' out what she thinkin' 'bout. Sometimes de gals fool derse'f, suh, but dat's mighty seldom. I dunner what all dey say, 'kase I ain't been in dar so mighty long 'fore I was nodding, but I did hear Marse Paul say he's drapped in fer 'pologize 'bout a little joke he played on Marse Tumlin. Miss Vallie ax what wuz de joke, an' he 'low dat Marse Tumlin was banterin' folks fer ter buy his wild land, an' Marse Paul ax him what he take fer it, an' Marse Tumlin 'low he'll take anything he kin chaw, sop, er drink. Dem wuz de words, chaw, sop, er drink. Wid dat, Marse Paul say he gi' him a box er terbacker, a barrel of syrup, an' a keg er peach brandy, an' throw in his buggy hoss fer good measure. Marse Tumlin say done, an' dey shook hands on it. Dat's what Marse Paul tole Miss Vallie, an' he 'low he's done it fer fun, 'kase he done looked inter dat wil' land, an' he 'low she wuff a pile er money. Well, sir, 'bout dat time I 'gun ter nod, an' den de few news I knowed, Miss Vallie wuz whackin' away on de pianner, an' it look ter me like she wuz des tryin' herse'f. By dat time dey wuz gittin' right chummy, an' so I curl up on de flo' an' dreamt dat de pianner chunes wuz comin' out'n a barrel des like 'lasses. When I waked up, Marse Paul Conant done gone, an' Marse Tumlin ain't come, an' Miss Vallie wuz settin' in de parlor lookin' up at de ceilin' like she got some mighty long thoughts. Her color wuz still up. I look at her an' laugh, an' she made a mouf at me, an' I say ter myse'f, 'Hey, sump'n de matter here, sho.' But I say out loud, 'Marse Paul Conant sho gwine ter ask me ef you ain't had a dram.' She'll laugh an' say, 'What answer you gwine ter make?' I low, 'I'll bow an' say, no, suh, I'm de one dat drinks all de dram fer de family.' Well, sir, dat child sot in ter laughin', an' she laugh an' laugh twel she wuz in ter hysterics. She wuz keyed up too high, ez you might say, an' dat's de way she come down ag'in. Bimeby Marse Tumlin come, an' Miss Vallie, she told 'im 'bout how Marse Paul done been dar, an' he sot dar, an' he did, an' hummed an' hawed, an' done so funny dat bimeby I low, 'Well, folks, I hatter tell you good night,' an' wid dat I went out." At this point Aunt Minervy leaned forward, clasped her hands over her knees, and shook her head. When she took up the thread of her narrative, if it can be called such, the tone of her voice was more subdued, almost confidential, in fact. "Nex' mornin' wuz my wash day, sir, an' 'bout 10 o'clock, when I got ready, they wa'n't no bluin' in de house, an' mighty little soap. I hunted high an' I hunted low, but no bluin' kin I find. An' dat make me mad, bekaze ef I hatter go downtown atter bluin' my wash day'll be broke inter. But 'tain't no good fer ter git mad, bekaze I wuz bleeze ter go atter de bluin'. So I tighten up my head hankcher an' flung a cape on my shoulders an' put out. I 'speck you know how it is, suh. You can't go downtown but what you'll see nigger women standin' in de front yards lookin' over de palin's. Dey all knowed me an' I knowed dem, an' de last blessed one of 'em hatter hails me ez I go by, an' I hatter stop an' pass de time er day, 'kaze ef I'd 'a' whipped on by, dey'd 'a' said I wuz gwine back bofe on my church an' on my color. I dunner how long dey kep' me, but time I got ter Proctor's sto' I knew I'd been on de way too long. I notice a crowd er men out dar, some settin' an' some standin', but I'd run in, I did, an' de young man what do the clerkin', he foller me in an' ax me what I want. I say I want a dime's wuth er bluin', an' after, please, suh, wrop it up des ez quick ez he can. I took notice dat while he was gettin' it out de box, he sorter stop like he's listenin' in ag'in. Whiles he had it in de scoop des ready fer drap it in de scales, he held his hand an' wait. Den I know he wuz lis'nen. Dat makes me listen, an' den I hear Marse Tumlin talkin', an' time I hear 'im I knowed he wuz irritated. 'Twa'n't bekaze he wuz talkin' loud, suh, but 'twuz he wuz talkin' level. When he talk loud he feelin' good. When he talk low, an' one word soun' de same ez nudder, den someone better git out his way. I lef de counter an' stepped ter de do' fer ter see what de matter wuz betwixt 'em. Well, suh, dar wuz Marse Tumlin standin' dar close to Tom Ferryman. Marse Tumlin low, 'Maybe de law done 'pinted you my gyardeen. How do you know I been swindled?' Tom Ferryman say, 'Bekaze I hear you say he bought yo' wil' lan' fer little or nothin'. He'll swindle you ef you trade wid 'im, an' you done trade wid 'im.' Marse Tumlin low, 'Is Pa Conant ever swindle you?' Tom Ferryman say, 'No, he ain't, an' ef he wuz I'd give 'im a kickin'.' Marse Tumlin low, 'Well, you know you is a swindler, an' nobody ain't kick you. How come dat?' Tom Ferryman say, 'Ef you say I'm a swindler, you're a liar.' Well, suh, de man ain't no sooner say dat dan bang went Marse Tumlin's pistol, an' des ez it banged Marse Paul Conant run 'twixt 'em, an' de ball went right sprang thoo de collar bone an' sorter sideways, thoo de p'int er de shoulder blade. Marse Tumlin dropped his pistol an' kotched him he fell an' knelt down by 'im, an' all de time dat dar Tom Ferryman wuz standin' right over 'im wid his pistol in his hand. I squall out, I did, 'Why'n't some er you white men take dat man's pistol 'way from 'im? Don't you see what he fixin' ter do?' I runned at 'im, an' he sorter flung back wid his arm, an' when he done dat, somebody grab 'im from behind. All dat time Marse Tumlin was askin' Marse Paul if he hurt much. I hear him say, 'I wouldn't 'a' done it fer de world, Conant, not fer de world.' Den de doctor, he come up, an' Marse Tumlin, he pester de man twel he hear him say, 'Don't worry, Major, dis boy'll live to be an older man dan you ever will.' Den Marse Tumlin got his pistol an' hunt up an' down fer dat Tom Ferryman, but he done gone. I seed 'im when he got on his hoss. I say to Marse Tumlin, 'Ain't you des as well to fetch Marse Paul Conant home while we all kin take keer of 'im?' He low, 'Dat's a fack. Go home an' tell yo' Miss Vallie fer to have de big room fixed up time we git dar wid 'im.' I say, 'Humph, I'll fix 'im myse'f. I know I ain't gwine ter let Miss Vallie do it.' Well, sir, 'tain't no use fer to tell you de rest. Dar's dat ar baby in dar, an' what mo' sign does you want ter show you dat it all turned out des like one er dem old time tales?" End of section 16.
International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Green in Tampa, Florida. International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories. Edited by William Patton. Section 17, A Kentucky Cinderella, by F. Hopkinson Smith. I was bending over my easel, hard at work upon a full-length portrait of a young girl in a costume of 50 years ago, when the door of my studio opened softly, and Aunt Chloe came in. "Good morning, sir. I didn't think you'd come today, being a Sunday," she said, with a slight bend of her knees. "I just sweep up a little mite. Don't you move. I won't disturb you." Aunt Chloe had first opened my door a year before with a note from Marnie, a brother Brush, which began, "Here is an old Southern mammy who has seen better days. Paint her if you can," and ended with, "Anyway, give her a job." The bearer of the note was indeed the ideal mammy, even to the bandana handkerchief bound about her head, and the capacious waist and ample bosom, the lullaby resting place for many a child, white and black. I had never seen a real one in the flesh before. I had heard about them in my earlier days. Daddy Billy, my father's body servant, and my father's slave, who lived to be 94, had told me of his own Aunt Myrie, who had died in the old days, but too far back for me to remember. And I had listened when a boy to the traditions connected with the plantations of my ancestors, of the Keziahs and Mammy Crouches and Mammy Janes. But I had never looked into the eyes of one of the old school until I saw Aunt Chloe, nor had I ever fully realized how quaintly courteous and gentle one of them could be, until, with an old-time manner born of a training seldom found outside the old Southern homes, she bent forward, spread her apron with both hands, and with a little backward dip had said, as she left me that first day, "Thank you, sir. I'll come every Sunday morning. I'll do my best to please you, and I specs I can." I do not often work on Sunday, but my picture had been too long delayed, waiting for a faded wedding dress, worn once by the original when she was a bride, and which had only been found when two of her descendants had ransacked their respective garrets. "Must be mighty drive, sir," she said, "a workin' on the Sabbath day. Golly, but that's a pretty lady," and she put down her pail. "I see it last Sunday when I come in, but she didn't have dem ruffles round her neck den dat you done gib her. 'Clare to goodness, dat child look like she was jes' a gwine speak." Aunt Chloe was leaning on her broom, her eyes scrutinizing the portrait. "Well, if dat don't beat de land, I ain't never seen none of dem frocks since de old times. And dem little old shoes wid de ribbons crossed on de ankles. She's de livin' personication. She is so, for a fact. It is difficult to convey this peculiar sound of complete approval in so many letters. "Did you ever know anybody like her?" I asked. The old woman straightened her back. and for a moment her eyes looked into mine. I had often tried to draw from her something of her earlier life, but she had always evaded my questions. Marnie had told me that his attempts had at first been equally disappointing.
"Body as old as me, sir, seen a plenty of people."
Then her eyes sought the canvas again. After a moment's pause, she said, as if to herself,
"You's de real quality, chile. Dat you is, every speck and spinch of you."
I tried again. "Does it look like anybody you ever saw, Aunt Chloe?"
"It do, and it don't," she answered critically. "De feet is like hern, but de eyes ain't."
"Who?"
"Oh, Miss Nanny."
And she leaned again on her broom and looked down on the floor. I heaped up a little pile of pigments on one corner of my palette, and flattened them for a highlight on a fold in the satin gown. "Who was Miss Nanny?" I asked carelessly. I was afraid the thread would break if I pulled too hard.
"One of my chillen, honey."
A peculiar softness came into her voice. "Tell me about her. It'll help me get her eyes right, so you can remember her better. They don't look human enough to me anyhow," this last to myself. "Where did she live?"
"Where they all live, down in de big house. She warn't Marse Henry's real child, but she come of de blood. She didn't have dem kind of shoes on her footses when I fust see her, but she wore 'em when she left me, dat she did."
Her voice rose suddenly, and her eyes brightened.
"An' dem ain't nothing to de way dey shined. I ain't never seen no satin slippers shine like dem slippers. They was jes' a blaze."
I worked on in silence. Marnie had cautioned me not to be too curious. Some day she might open her heart and tell me wonderful stories of her earlier life, but I must not appear too anxious. She had become rather suspicious of strangers since she had moved north and lost track of her own people, Marnie had said. Aunt Chloe picked up her pail and began moving some easels into a far corner of my studio and piling the chairs in a heap. This done, she stopped again and stood behind me, looking intently at the canvas over my shoulder.
My, ain't dat de very image of dat frock? I can see it now, jes' as Miss Nanny come down de stairs. But you got to put dat gold chain on it 'fore it gets to be de very express image. I had it round my own neck once. I knew jes' how it looked."
I laid down my palette, and picking up a piece of chalk, asked her to describe it so that I could make an outline.
"It was long and heavy, and it wound round de neck twice and hung down to de waist. And dat watch on de end of it, well, I ain't seen none like dat one since. I 'clar to you it was jes' as teeny as one of dem little biscuits I used to make for her when she come in de kitchen, and she was dere most of de time. Dey didn't care nothing for her much. Let her go round barefoot half de time, and her hair a-flyin'. Only one good frock to her name, and dat warn't nothing but calico. I used to wash dat many a time for her long 'fore she was outen de bed. Allus makes my blood bile to dis day whenever I think of de way they treated dat child. But it didn't make no difference what she had on, shoes or no shoes. Her footses was dat little, and purty, wid her big eyes and her cheeks jes' as fresh as dem rosewater roses dat I used to snip off for ole Sam to put on de table. Oh, I tell ye, if you could picter her like dat, dey wouldn't be nobody clear from here to glory come nigh her."
Aunt Chloe's eyes were kindling with every word. I remembered Marnie's warning and kept still. I had abandoned the sketch of the chain as an unnecessary incentive, and had begun again with my palette knife, pottering away, nodding appreciatingly, and now and then putting a question to clear up some tangled situation as to dates and localities, which her rambling talk had left unsettled.
"Yes, sir, down in de bluegrass country near Lexington, Kentucky, whar my old master, Mars Henry Gordon, lived," she answered to my inquiry as to where this all happened. "I used to go every year to see him after the war was over, and kept it up till he died. There warn't nobody like him den, and there ain't none now. He warn't never spiteful to chillen, white or black. Everybody knowed dat. I was a pickaninny myself, and I belonged to him, and he ain't never laid a lick on me, and he wouldn't let nobody else do it nuther, 'cept my mammy. I 'members one time when Aunt Dinah made a cake that old Sam, he were a heap younger den, couldn't put on the table 'cause there was a piece broke out in it. Sam he riz, and Dinah she riz, and after they all called each other all the names they could lay their tongues to, Miss Ann, my own first mistress, come in and she said them chillen took that cake, and 'tain't nary one of you that's 'sponsible. "What's dis?" says Mars Henry. "Chillen, stealing cake? Send 'em here to me." When we all come in, there was 6 or 8 of us, he says, "Every one of you look me in the eye. Now which one took it?" I kept looking away, first on the floor, then out the windy. "Look at me," he says again. "You ain't looking, Clorindy." Then I cotched him watching me. "Now you all go out," he says, "and the one that's guilty can come back again." Then we all went out in the yard. "You tell him," says one. "No, you tell him," and that's the way it went on. I knowed I was the worstest, for I opened the door of the sideboard and gin it to the others. Then I thought, if I don't tell him, maybe he'll lick the whole passel on us, and that ain't right. But if I go tell him and beg his humble pardon, he might let me go. So I crept round where he was settin' with his book on his knee.
Aunt Chloe was now moving stealthily behind me, her eyes fixed on her imaginary master, head down, one finger in her mouth.
And I say, "Mars Henry," and he look up and say, "Who's dat?" And I say, "Dat's Clorindy," and he say, "What you want?" "Mars Henry, I come to tell you I was hungry, and I seed the door open, and I shove it back and took the piece of the cake, and I thought maybe if I done told you, you'd forgive me." "Den you is the ringleader," he says, "and you tempted the other chillen?" "Yes," I says, "I spec so." "Well," he says, looking down on the carpet, "now that you has professed and begged pardon, you is good and ready to pay attention to what I'm going to say. The other chillen had sneaked up and was listening. They expected to see me get it, though they ain't nary one of them ever knowed him to strike 'em a lick. Then he says, 'This here is a little thing, this stealing a cake, and it's a big thing at the same time. Miss Ann has been right smart put out about it, and I'm going to see that it don't happen again. If you see a pin on the floor, you wouldn't steal it, you'd pick it up if you wanted it, and it wouldn't be nothing 'cause somebody throwed it away, and it was free to everybody. But if you see a piece of money on the floor, you know nobody didn't throw that away, and if you pick it up and don't tell, that's something else. That's stealing, 'cause you took something that somebody else had paid something for and that belongs to him. Now this cake ain't of much count, but it warn't yourn, and you oughtn't have took it. If you'd asked your mistress for it, she'd gi'n you a piece. There ain't nothing here you children don't get when you ask for it.' I didn't say nothing more. I just waited for him to do anything he wanted to me. Then he looks at the carpet for a long time, and he says, 'I reckon you won't take no more cake without asking for it, Clorindy, and you children can go out and play again.'
The tears were now standing in her eyes.
That's what my old master was, sir. I ain't never forgot it. If he had beat me to death, he couldn't have done no more for me. He just explained to me, and I ain't never forgot since."
"Did your own mother find it out?" I asked. The tears were gone now. Her face was radiant again at my question.
"That she did, sir. One of the children done told on me. Mammy just made one grab as I run past the kitchen door and reached for a barrel stave, and she fairly sot me afire."
Aunt Chloe was now holding her sides with laughter, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks.
"But Mars Henry never knowed it. Lord, sir, there ain't nobody round here like him. nor never was. I can remember him now, same as it was yesterday, with his white hair, and he is setting in his big chair. It was the last time I ever see him. The big house was gone, and the colored people was gone, and he was that poor he didn't know where the next mouthful was coming from. I come out behind him so. Aunt Chloe made me her old master, and my stool his rocking chair. And I pat him on the shoulder this way, and he say, 'Chloe, is that you? How is it you look so comfortable like?' And I say, 'It's you, Marse Henry. You done it all. Your teaching made me what I is. And if you study about it, you'll know it's so. And the others ain't no worse. Of all the colored people you owned, there ain't nary one been hung or been in the penitentiary, nor ain't known as liars. That's the way you fotches up. And I love him yet, and if he was a living today, I'd work for him and take care of him if I went hungry myself. The only fool thing Master Henry ever done was a marrying that widow woman for his second wife, Miss Nanny, that looks a little bit like that child you got there before you,' and she pointed to the canvas. 'Wouldn't have been sot and abused like she was but for her. That woman warn't nothing but a harp stringer no way, if I do say it. Everybody know that. How Morris Henry Gordon come to marry her, and nobody knowed her this day. She warn't none of our people. They do say that he met her up to Frankfort when he was in the legislature, but I don't know if that's so. But she warn't nothing nohow.'
Was Miss Nanny her child? I asked, stepping back from my easel to get the better effect of my canvas.
'No, sir, that she warn't,'
with emphasis.
'She was Marse Henry's own sister's child, she was. Her people, Miss Nanny's, lived up in Indiany, and they was just as poor as watermelon rinds. And when her mother died, Marse Henry sent for her to come live with him, 'cause he said Miss Rachel, that was that woman's own child by her first husband, was lonesome. They was both about the one age, 14 or 15 years old, but Lord a massy, Miss Rachel warn't lonesome, 'cept for what he couldn't get, and she most broke her heart about that, much as she could break it about anything. I remember the very day Miss Nanny come. I see her coming down the road, toting a big bandbox and a carpet bag most big as herself. Then she turned in the gate. 'Fore God,' I says to old Sam, who was setting the table for dinner, 'who's this here coming in?' Then I see her stop and set the bundles down and catch her breath, and then she come on again. 'That's Marse Henry's niece,' he says. 'I heard the mistress say she was a-comin' one day this week by the coach.' I see right away that that woman was up to one of her tricks. She didn't tend to let that child come no other way except like a servant. She was that dirt mean. Oh, you needn't look, sir. I ain't meanin' no unrespect, but I knowed that woman when Marse Henry first married her, and she ain't never fooled me once. First time she come into the house, she walked plumb in the kitchen, where me and old Sam and old Dinah was eatin' our dinner. We settin' at the table like we used to did, and she flung her head up in the air, and she says, 'After dis, when I come in, I want you niggers to get up on your feet.' Think of that, will you? Marse Henry never called nary one of us nigger since we was pickaninnies. I know then she warn't accustomed to nothing. But I tell you, she never put on them kind of airs when Marse Henry was about. No, sir. She was always mighty sugar-like to him when he was home. But there ain't no conniption she warn't up to when he couldn't hear it. She had pretty nigh riz the roof when he done tell her that Miss Nanny was a-comin' to live with him. But she couldn't stand agin him, for warn't her only daughter, Miss Rachel, livin' on him? And not only Miss Rachel, but lots more of her people where she come from. Well, sir, as soon as old Sam said what child it was that was a-comin' down the road, I dropped my dishcloth and I run out to meet her. 'Is you Miss Nanny?' I says. 'Give me that bag,' I says, 'and that box.' 'Yes,' she says, 'that's me. And ain't you Aunt Chloe what I heard so much about? Honey, you ain't never gwine to get the kind of look on that picture you was working on there, sir, as sweet as that child's face when she said that to me. I loved her from that first minute I see her, and I loved her ever since, just as I love her mother before her. When she got to the house, me a-toting the things on behind, the mistress come out on the porch. 'Oh, that's you, is it, Nanny?' she says. 'Well, Chloe'll tell you where to go.' And she went straight in the house again, never kissed her, nor touched her, nor nothing. Old Sam was a violent. He heard her say it, and if he was alive he'd tell you same as me. 'Where's she going to sleep?' I asked, calling after her. 'Upstairs, along with Miss Rachel?' I was getting hot myself, though I didn't say nothing. 'No,' she says, flinging her head up like a goat. 'My daughter needs all the room she's got. You can take her downstairs and fix up a place for her alongside of you and Dinah.' She was the old cook. 'Come along,' I says, 'Miss Nanny,' and I dropped a curtsy same as if she was a princess. And so she was, and Marse Henry's own eyes in her head, enough like him to be his own child. 'I'll have everything ready for you,' I says. 'You wait here and take the air.' And I got a chair and sot her down on the porch, and old Sam brung her some cake, and I went to get the room ready, the room off the kitchen pantry where they puts the overseer's children when they come to see him. Pretty soon Miss Rachel come down and went up and kissed her. That is, Sam said so, though I ain't never seen her kiss her that time nor no other time. Miss Rachel and the mistress was both split out of the same piece of kindling, and what one was again, t'other was again. A blind man could see that Miss Rachel never liked Miss Nanny from the first. She was that cross-grained and pernickety. No matter what Miss Nanny done to please her, it warn't good enough for her. Why, do you know, when the other children come over from the next plantation, Miss Rachel wouldn't send for Miss Nanny to come in the parlor. No, sir, that she wouldn't. And they'd run off and leave her, too, when they was gwine picnicking, and treat that child audacious, saying she was po' white trash and charity child and things like that, till I would go and tell Marse Henry about it. Then there'd be a ruction, and Marse Henry'd blaze out, and just soon as he was off again to Frankfort, and he was there most of the time, for he was one of these year old-timers that they couldn't get along without at the legislature, they'd treat her worse'n ever. Soon's Dinah and me see that, we keep Miss Nanny along with us much as we could. She'd eat with 'em when there warn't no company around, but that was about all.
"Did they send her to school?" I asked, fearing that she would again lose the thread. My picture had a new meaning for me, now that it looked like her heroine.
No, sir, that they didn't, 'cept to the schoolhouse at the crossroads, where everybody's children went. But they sent Miss Rachel to a real highty-tighty school, that they did, down to Louisville. 2 winters she was there, and every time when she come home for holiday times she had more airs than when she went away. Marse Henry wanted both children to go, but that woman outdid him, and she faced him up and down that there warn't money enough for 2, and that her daughter was the fittest and all that, and he give in. I didn't hear it, but old Sam did, and his hand shook so he most spilt the soup. But, law, honey, that didn't make no difference to Miss Nanny. She'd go off by herself with her books and sit all day under the trees and sing to herself just like a bird, and they'd sing to her. And all that time her face was a beaming and her hair shining like gold, and she a growing taller, and her eyes getting bigger and brighter, and her little footses white and cunning as a rabbit's. The only place where she did go outside the big house was over to Miss Morgan's, who lived on the next plantation. Miss Morgan didn't have no children of her own, and she'd send for Miss Nanny to come and keep her company. She was that dead lonesome, and they was glad enough to let the child go so they could get her out of the house. Old Sam allers said that, for he heard 'em talk at the table and knowed what was gwine on. Purty soon, 'long come de time when Miss Rachel done finish her edication, and she come back to de big house and sot herself up to 'ceive company. She warn't bad lookin' in dem days, I must say, and if dat woman's spirit hadn't been in her she might have pulled through. But there warn't no fetchin' up could stand agin dat blood. Miss Rachel get dat ornery dat you couldn't do nothin' with her, just like her ma. The first real out-and-out beau she had was Dr. Tom Bowling. He lived 'bout 14 miles out of Lexington on de big plantation, and was the richest young man in our parts. His pa had died about 2 years before, and left him more money than he could throw away, and he'd just come back from Philadelphia where he'd been a-learning to be a doctor. He met Miss Rachel at a party in Louisville, and the first Sunday she come home he driv over to see her. If you could 'a' seen the mistress when she see him comin' in the gate, all his riding boots and his yaller breeches and bottle green coat, and his servant a-riding behind to hold the horses. Old Sam and me was a-watchin' the mistress peekin' through the blind at him, her eyes a-blazin', and Sam laughed so he had to stuff a napkin in his mouth to keep her from hearing him. Well, so dat went on all the summer. Every time he come, the mistress be dat sweet, most make a body sick to see her, and when he'd stay away, she was dat pesky there warn't no livin' with her. Of course, there was plenty more gemmen courtin' Miss Rachel, too, but none of dem didn't count with the mistress except the doctor, 'cause he was rich. That's all there was to it, 'cause he was rich. I tell you, old Sam had to tell many a lie to the other gentlemen, sayin' Miss Rachel was sick or something else, when she was a-waitin' for the doctor to come, and was feared he might meet some of 'em and get skeered away. Miss Nanny, she'd watch him, too, from behind the kitchen door, or scrunch down lookin' over the pantry window-sill, and then she'd tell Dinah and me what he did, and how he got off his horse and hand the reins to the boy and slap his boots with his riding whip like he was a-dustin' off a fly. And she'd act it all out for me and Dinah and slap her own frock, and then she'd laugh to fit to kill herself and dance all around the kitchen. Would you believe it? No, there ain't nobody'd believe it. They never asked her to come in once while he was in the parlor, and they never once told him that Miss Nanny was a-livin' on top side of the earth. Course, people gin a talk, and everybody say that Dr. Bowling was gettin' nighest to coon, and the first thing they know there would be a weddin' in the Gordon family. And then again, there was plenty more people said he was only passin' the time with Miss Rachel, and that he come to see Mars Henry to talk politics. Well, one day, sir, I was standin' in the door, and I see him come in afoot without his horse and servant, and step up on the porch quick and rap at the door like he say to himself, "Let me in. I'm in a hurry. I got something on my mind." Old Sam was just a-goin' to open the door for him when Miss Nanny come a-runnin' in the kitchen from the yard, her cheeks like the roses, her hair a-flyin', and her big hat a-hangin' to a string down her back. I gin Sam one look, and he stopped. And I says to Miss Nanny, "Run, honey," I says, "and open the door for old Sam. I spec," I says, "it's one of them peddlers." If you could have seen that child's face when she come back.
Aunt Chloe's hands were now waving above her head, her mouth wide open in her merriment, every tooth shining.
She was white one minute and red as a beet the next. "Oh, Aunt Chloe, what did you let me go for?" she says. "Oh, I wouldn't have let him see me like this for anything in the world. Oh, I am that put out." "What did he say to you, honey?" I says. "He didn't say nothing. He just look at me and say he begged my pardon and was Miss Rachel in, and then I said I'd run and tell her, and when I come downstairs again, he was a-standing in the hall with his eyes up the staircase, and he never stopped looking at me till I come down. Well, that won't do you no harm, child, I says. A cat can look at a king. Old Sam was a-watching her, too, and when she'd gone in her little room and shut the door, Sam says, I lay if Marse Tom Bowling had anything on his mind when he come here today, it's mighty unsettled by this time. Next time Dr. Tom Bowling come, he say to the mistress, Who's that young lady, he says, that opened the door for me last time I was here? I hope to see her again. Is she in? Then they both cooked up some lie about her being over to Miss Morgan's or something, and soon's he was gone, they come down and riz Sam for not tending the door and letting that ragged fly-away gal open it. Then they went for Miss Nanny till they made her cry, and she come to me, and I took her in my lap and comforted her like I allers did. The next time he come, he says, I hear that your niece, Miss Nanny Barnes, is living with you, and that she very exclusive. I hope that you'll swayed her to come in the parlor, he says. Them was his very words. Sam was standing close to him as I am to you, and he heard him. She ain't yet in society, the mister says, and she's that wild that we can't present her. Oh, is that so, he says. Is she in now? No, she says. She's over to Miss Morgan's. That was a fact this time. She gone that very morning. Then Miss Rachel come down, and course Sam didn't hear no more, 'cause he had to go out. Pretty soon, out the doctor come. These visits, mind you, was getting shorter and shorter, though he do come as often, and over he goes to Miss Morgan's hisself. Now, I don't know what he said to Miss Nanny or what passed twixt 'em, 'cause she didn't tell me. Only that she said he had come to see Miss Morgan about some land matters, and that Miss Morgan introduced 'em, but nothing more. Lord bless that child! And, sir, that was the first time she ever kept anything from her old mammy. That made me more glad than ever. I know then they was both hit. But, my Lord, the fur began to fly when the mistress and Miss Rachel heard about that visit. What you mean making eyes at Dr. Bowling? Don't you know he's good as engaged to my daughter, the mistress said. That was a lie, for he never said a word to Miss Rachel. Old Sam could have told you that. Get out of my house, you good-for-nothing pauper, and take your rags with you. I see right away the fat was in the fire. Mars Henry warn't expected home till next Sunday, and so I took her over to Miss Morgan, and then I ups and tells her everything that woman had done to that child since the day she come. And when I done, she took Miss Nanny by the hand, and she says, You won't never want a home child so long as I live. Go back, Chloe, and get her clothes. But I didn't get 'em. I knowed Mars Henry'd raise the roof when he come, and he did, bless your heart. Went over hisself and got her and brought her home, and that night when Dr. Bowling come, he made her sit down in the parlor, and 'fore he went home that night, the doctor, he say to Mars Henry, I want your permission, Mr. Gordon, to pay my addresses to Miss Nanny, your niece. Sam was a-standing close as he could get to the door, and he heard every word. Now, he ain't never said that, mind you, to Mars Henry about Miss Rachel, and that's why I know that he warn't hit unto death with her. Well, do you know, sir, that that woman was that audacious, she wouldn't let 'em see each other after that except on the front porch. Wouldn't let 'em come in the house. Make 'em do all their courting on the steps and out at the pasture gate. The doctor would rail and pitch and get white in the face at the scandalous way that Miss Barnes was being treated, until Miss Nanny put both her little hands on his'n, soothing like, and then he'd grab 'em and kiss 'em like he'd eat 'em up. Sam cotched 'em at it, and he done told me, and then they'd saunter off down the porch, saying it was too hot or too cool, or that they was looking for birds' nests in the poached vines, till they'd get to the far end where the mistus nor Sam nor nobody else could hear what they was a-sayin' and a-whisperin', and there they'd sit for hours. But I tell you, the doctor had a hard time a-gettin' her, even when Marse Henry gin his consent. And he never would 'a' got her if Miss Rachel, jest for spite, I spect, hadn't 'a' took up with Colonel Todhunter's son that was a-courtin' on her too, and run off and married him. Then Miss Nanny knowed she was free to follow her own heart. I tell you, it'd 'a' made you cry your eyes out, sir, to see that child try and fix herself up to meet him the days and nights she knowed he was a-comin', and she was just one white frock to her name, and we all felt just as bad as her. Dinah would wash it, and I'd smooth her hair, and old Sam would get a fresh rose to put in her neck. Pretty soon the weddin' day was p'inted, and me and Dinah and old Sam 'gin to wonder how that child was a-gwine to get clothes to be married in. Sam heard old marster ask that same question at the table, and he see him give the mistus the money to buy 'em for her, and the mistus said that she reckoned Miss Nanny's people would want the privilege of dressin' her now that she was a-gwine to marry that worthless young Dr. Tom Bowling that nobody would have in the house, but that if they didn't she'd gin her some of Rachel's clothes, and if them warn't enough, then she'd spend the money to the best advantage. Them was her very words. Sam heard her say 'em. I knowed that meant that the child would go naked, for she wouldn't have worn none of Miss Rachel's rubbish, and not a cent would she get of the money. So I got that old white frock out, and Dinah found a white ribbon in an old trunk in the garret, and washed and ironed it to tie round her waist. And Miss Nanny come and look at it, and when she see it, the tears riz up in her eyes. 'Don't you cry, child,' I says. 'He ain't lovin' you for your clothes, and never did. First time he see you, you was pretty nigh barefoot. It's you he wants, not your frocks, honey.' And then the sun come out on her face, and her eyes dried up, and she 'gin to smile and sing like a robin after the rain. Pretty soon 'long come Christmas time, and me and old Sam and Dinah was watchin' out to see what Marse Tom Bowling was gwine to gin his bride, for she was pretty nigh dat as they was to be married the week after Christmas. Well, sir, the mornin' 'fore Christmas come, and then the arternoon come, and then the night come, and most every hour somebody sent something for Miss Rachel, and yet not one scrap of nothing as big as a chinkapin come for Miss Nanny. Dinah and me was dat unrestless that we couldn't sleep. Miss Nanny didn't say nothing when she went to bed, but I see a little shadder creep over her face, and I knowed right away what hurted her. Well, the next mornin', Christmas mornin' that was, old Sam come a-bustin' in the kitchen door, a-hollerin' loud as he could holler.
Aunt Chloe was now rocking herself back and forth, clapping her hands as she talked.
That there was a trunk on the front porch for Miss Nanny that was that heavy it took 4 niggers to lift it. I run and Dinah run, and when we got to the trunk, most all the niggers was thick around it as flies, and Miss Nanny was standing over it reading a card with her name on it, and a scription saying that it was a Christmas gift with the compliments of a friend. But who that friend was, whether it was Marse Henry who sent it that way so that that woman wouldn't tear his hair out, or whether Miss Morgan sent it that hadn't more 'n enough money to live on, or whether some of her own kin in Indiany that was dirt po' stole the money and sent it, or whether the young Dr. Tom Bowling, who had more money than all the banks in Lexington, done did it. Don't nobody know to this day 'cept me and old Sam, and we ain't tellin'. But my soul alive, the insides of that trunk took the breath clean out of the mistress and Miss Rachel. Sam opened it, and I took out the things. Honey, there was a weddin' dress, all white satin, that would stand alone, just the very mate of the one you got in that picture for you, and a changeable silk that heavy, and a plaid one, and everything a young lady could get on her back from her skin out, and $1,000 watch and chain. I wore that watch myself. Miss Nanny was a-standing by me, a-clapping her hands and laughing, and when that watch and chain came out, she just throwed the chain over my neck and stuck the little watch in my bosom, and says, 'There, you dear old mammy, go look at yourself in the glass and see how fine you is.' The next week come the wedding. I'll never forget that wedding to my dying day. Mars Tom Bowling driv in with a coach and four and 2 outriders, and the horses wore white ribbons on their ears, and the coachman had flowers in his coat most big as his head, and they whirled up in front of the porch, and out he stepped in his blue coat and brass buttons and a yaller waistcoat, yaller as a gourd, and his bell-crown hat in his hand. She was a-waitin' for him with that white satin dress on, and the chain round her neck, and her little footses tied up with silk ribbons, the very match of dem you got pictured, and her face shining like an angel. And all the niggers was a-standing round the porch, their eyes outen their heads. And Mars Henry was there in his new clothes, looking so grand, and Sam in his white gloves, and me in a new head handkerchief. Everybody was happy, 'cept one. That one was the mistus standing in the door. She wouldn't come out to the coach where the horses was a-chomping the bits and the froth a-dropping on the ground, and she wouldn't speak to Mars Tom. She kept back in the doorway. Miss Rachel was that mean, she wouldn't come downstairs. Miss Nanny give Mars Tom Bowling her hand and look up in his face like a queen, and then she kissed Mars Henry and whispered something in his ear that nobody didn't hear, only the tears gin to jump out and roll down his cheeks, and then she looked the mistus full in the face, and without a word dropped her a low curtsy. I come the last. She looked at me for a minute with her eyes a-swimming, and then she throwed her arms round my neck and hugged and kissed me, and then I see her arms slip around her waist and lift her in the coach, and then the horses began to plunge, and they was off. And after that they had 5 years, the happiest years them two ever seen. I know, 'cause Mars Henry give me to her, and I lived with 'em day in and day out till that baby come, and then—"
Aunt Chloe stopped and reached out her hand as if to steady herself. The tears were streaming down her cheeks. Then she advanced a step, fixed her eyes on the portrait, and in a voice broken with emotion said, honey, child, is you tired of waiting for your old mammy? Keep a-watching, honey, keep a-watching. It won't be long now 'fore I come. Keep a-watching. End of section 17. Recording by Larry Green in Tampa, Florida.
International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories, edited by William Patton. Section 18, By the Waters of Paradise, by F. Marion Crawford. Part 1. I remember my childhood very distinctly. I do not think that the fact argues a good memory, for I have never been clever at learning words by heart, in prose or rhyme. So that I believe my remembrance of events depends much more upon the events themselves than upon my possessing any special facility for recalling them. Perhaps I am too imaginative, and the earliest impressions I received were of a kind to stimulate the imagination abnormally. A long series of little misfortunes, so connected with each other as to suggest a sort of weird fatality, so worked upon my melancholy temperament when I was a boy that, before I was of age, I sincerely believed myself to be under a curse, and not only myself, but my whole family, and every individual who bore my name. I was born in the old place where my father and his father and all his predecessors had been born, beyond the memory of man. It is a very old house, and the greater part of it was originally a castle, strongly fortified, and surrounded by a steep moat supplied with abundant water from the hills by a hidden aqueduct. Many of the fortifications have been destroyed and the moat has been filled up. The water from the aqueduct supplies great fountains and runs down into huge oblong basins in the terraced gardens, one below the other, each surrounded by a broad pavement of marble between the water and the flower beds. The waste surplus finally escapes through an artificial grotto some 30 yards long into a stream, flowing down through the park to the meadows beyond, and thence to the distant river. The buildings were extended a little and greatly altered more than 200 years ago in the time of Charles II. But since then little has been done to improve them, though they have been kept in fairly good repair according to our fortunes. In the gardens there are terraces and huge hedges of box and evergreen, some of which used to be clipped into shapes of animals in the Italian style. I can remember, when I was a lad, how I used to try to make out what the trees were cut to represent, and how I used to appeal for explanations to Judith, my Welsh nurse. She dealt in a strange mythology of her own, and peopled the gardens with griffins, dragons, good, genii, and bad, and filled my mind with them at the same time. My nursery window afforded a view of the great fountains at the head of the upper basin, and on moonlight nights the Welshwoman would hold me up to the glass and bid me look at the mist and spray rising into mysterious shapes, moving mystically in the white light like living things. "It's the woman of the water," she used to say, and sometimes she would threaten that, if I did not go to sleep, the woman of the water would steal up to the high window and carry me away in her wet arms. The place was gloomy. The broad basins of water and the tall evergreen hedges gave it a funeral look, and the damp stained marble causeways by the pools might have been made of tombstones. The grey and weather-beaten walls and towers without, the dark and massively furnished rooms within, the deep, mysterious recesses, and the heavy curtains, all affected my spirits. I was silent and sad from my childhood. There was a great clock tower above, from which the hours rang dismally during the day, and tolled like a knell in the dead of night. There was no light, no life in the house, for my mother was a helpless invalid, and my father had grown melancholy in his long task of caring for her. He was a thin, dark man, with sad eyes. Kind, I think, but silent and unhappy. Next to my mother, I believe he loved me better than anything on earth, for he took immense pains and trouble in teaching me, and what he taught me I have never forgotten. Perhaps it was his only amusement, and that may be the reason why I had no nursery governess or teacher of any kind while he lived. I used to be taken to see my mother every day, and sometimes twice a day, for an hour at a time. Then I sat upon a little stool near her feet, and she would ask me what I'd been doing and what I wanted to do. I dare say she saw already the seeds of a profound melancholy in my nature, for she looked at me always with a sad smile, and kissed me with a sigh when I was taken away. One night, when I was just 6 years old, I lay awake in the nursery. The door was not quite shut, and the Welsh nurse was sitting sewing in the next room. Suddenly I heard her groan and say in a strange voice, "1, 2, 1, 2." I was frightened, and I jumped up and ran to the door, barefooted as I was. "What is it, Judith?" I cried, clinging to her skirts. I can remember the look in her strange, dark eyes as she answered, "1, 2, leaden coffins, fallen from the ceiling," she crooned, working herself in her chair. "1, 2, a light coffin and a heavy coffin, falling to the floor." Then she seemed to notice me, and she took me back to bed and sang me to sleep with a queer old Welsh song. I do not know how it was, but the impression got hold of me that she had meant that my father and mother were going to die very soon. They died in the very room where she had been sitting that night. It was a great room, my day nursery, full of sun when there was any, and when the days were dark it was the most cheerful place in the house. My mother grew rapidly worse, and I was transferred to another part of the building to make place for her. They thought my nursery was gayer for her, I suppose, but she could not live. She was beautiful when she was dead, and I cried bitterly. "The light one, the light one, the heavy one to come," crooned the Welshwoman, and she was right. My father took the room after my mother was gone, and day by day he grew thinner and paler and sadder. "The heavy one, all of lead," moaned my nurse one night in December, standing still, just as she was going to take away the light after putting me to bed. Then she took me up again and wrapped me in a little gown, and led me away to my father's room. She knocked, but no one answered. She opened the door, and we found him in his easy chair before the fire, very white, quite dead. So I was alone with the Welshwoman till strange people came, and relations whom I had never seen. And then I heard them saying that I must be taken away to some more cheerful place. They were kind people, and I will not believe that they were kind only because I was to be very rich when I grew to be a man. The world never seemed to be a very bad place to me, nor all the people to be miserable sinners. Even when I was most melancholy, I do not remember that any one ever did me any great injustice, nor that I was ever oppressed or ill-treated in any way, even by the boys at school. I was sad, I suppose, because my childhood was so gloomy, and, later, because I was unlucky in everything I undertook, till I finally believed I was pursued by fate. And I used to dream that the old Welsh nurse and the woman of the water, between them, had vowed to pursue me to my end. But my natural disposition should have been cheerful, as I have often thought. Among the lads of my age I was never last, or even among the last, in anything. But I was never first. If I trained for a race, I was sure to sprain my ankle on the day when I was to run. If I pulled an oar with others, my oar was sure to break. If I competed for a prize, some unforeseen accident prevented my winning it at the last moment. Nothing to which I put my hand succeeded, and I got the reputation of being unlucky until my companions felt it was always safe to bet against me, no matter what the appearances might be. I became discouraged and listless in everything. I gave up the idea of competing for any distinction at the university, comforting myself with the thought that I could not fail in the examination for the ordinary degree. The day before the examination began, I fell ill, and when at last I recovered, after a narrow escape from death, I turned my back upon Oxford, and went down alone to visit the old place where I had been born, feeble in health, and profoundly disgusted and discouraged. I was 21 years of age, master of myself and of my fortune, but so deeply had the long chain of small unlucky circumstances affected me, that I thought seriously of shutting myself up from the world, to live the life of a hermit, and to die as soon as possible. Death seemed the only cheerful possibility in my existence, and my thoughts soon dwelt upon it altogether. I had never shown any wish to return to my own home since I had been taken away as a little boy, and no one had ever pressed me to do so. The place had been kept in order after a fashion, and did not seem to have suffered during the 15 years or more of my absence. Nothing earthly could affect those old grey walls who had fought the elements for so many centuries. The garden was more wild than I remember it. The marble causeways about the pools looked more yellow and damp than of old, and the whole place at first looked smaller. It was not until I had wandered about the house and grounds for many hours that I realized the huge size of the home where I was to live in solitude. Then I began to delight in it, and my resolution to live alone grew stronger. The people had turned out to welcome me, of course, and I tried to recognize the changed faces of the old gardener and the old housekeeper, and to call them by name. My old nurse I knew at once. She had grown very grey since she heard the coffins fall in the nursery 15 years before. But her strange eyes were the same, and the look in them woke all my old memories. She went over the house with me. "And how is the woman of the water?" I asked, trying to laugh a little. "Does she still play in the moonlight?" "She's hungry," answered the Welshwoman in a low voice. "Hungry? Then we will feed her," I laughed. But old Judith turned very pale and looked at me strangely. "Feed her? Eh, you will feed her well," she muttered, glancing behind her at the ancient housekeeper, who tottered after us, with fewer steps through the halls and passages. I didn't think much of her words. She had always talked oddly, the huge size of the home where I was to live in solitude. Then I began to delight in it, and my resolution to live alone grew stronger. The people had turned out to welcome me, of course, and I tried to recognize the changed faces of the old gardener and the old housekeeper, and to call them by name. My old nurse I knew at once. She had grown very grey since she heard the coffins fall in the nursery 15 years before. But her strange eyes were the same, and the look in them woke all my old memories. She went over the house with me. "And how is the woman of the water?" I asked, trying to laugh a little. "Does she still play in the moonlight?" "She is hungry," answered the Welshwoman in a low voice. "Hungry? Then we will feed her," I laughed, but old Judith turned very pale and looked at me strangely. "Feed her? You will feed her well," she muttered, glancing behind her at the ancient housekeeper, who tottered after us with feeble steps through the halls and passages. I did not think much of her word. She had always talked oddly, as Welshwomen will, and though I was melancholy, I am sure I was not superstitious, and I was certainly not timid. Only, as in a far-off dream, I seemed to see her standing with the light in her hand and muttering, "The heavy one, wall of lead," and then leading a little boy through the long corridors to see his father lying dead in a great easy-chair before a smouldering fire. So we went over the house, and I chose the rooms where I would live, and the servants I had brought with me ordered and arranged everything, and I had no more trouble. I did not care what they did, provided I was left in peace and was not expected to give directions, for I was more listless than ever, owing to the effects of my illness at college. I dined in solitary state, and the melancholy grandeur of the vast old dining room pleased me. Then I went to the room I had selected for my study, and sat down in a deep chair under a bright light to think, or to let my thoughts meander through labyrinths of their own choosing, utterly indifferent to the course they might take. The tall windows of the room opened to the level of the ground upon the terrace at the head of the garden. It was in the end of July, and everything was open, for the weather was warm. As I sat alone, I heard the unceasing splash of the great fountains, and I fell to thinking of the woman of the water. I rose and went out into the still night, and sat down upon a seat on the terrace between two gigantic Italian flower pots. The air was deliciously soft and sweet with the smell of the flowers, and the garden was more congenial to me than the house. Sad people always like running water and the sound of it at night, though I cannot tell why. I sat and listened in the gloom, for it was dark below, and the pale moon had not yet climbed over the hills in front of me, though all the air above was light with her rising beams. Slowly the white halo in the eastern sky ascended in an arch above the wooded crest, making the outlines of the mountains more intensively black by contrast, as though the head of some great white saint were rising from behind a screen in a vast cathedral, throwing misty glories from below. I longed to see the moon herself, and I tried to recount the seconds before she must appear. Then She sprang up quickly, and in a moment more hung around and perfect in the sky. I gazed at her, and then at the floating spray of the tall fountains, and down at the pools, where the water lilies were rocking softly in their sleep on the velvet surface of the moonlit water. Just then a great swan floated out silently into the midst of the basin, and raised his long neck, catching the water in his broad bill, and scattering showers of diamonds around him. Suddenly, as I gazed, something came between me and the light. I looked up instantly. Between me and the round disk of the moon rose a luminous face of a woman, with great strange eyes, and a woman's mouth, full and soft, but not smiling, hooded in black, staring at me as I sat still upon my bench. She was close to me, so close that I could have touched her with my hand, but I was transfixed and helpless. She stood still for a moment, but her expression did not change. Then she passed swiftly away, and my hair stood up on my head, while the cold breeze from her white dress was wafted to my temples as she moved. The moonlight, shining through the tossing spray of the fountain, made tracery of shadow in the gleaming folds of her garments. In an instant she was gone, and I was alone. I was strangely shaken by the vision, and some time passed before I could rise to my feet, for I was still weak from my illness, and the sight I had seen would have startled any one. I did not reason with myself, for I was certain that I had looked upon the unearthly, and no argument could have destroyed that belief. At last I got up and stood unsteadily, gazing in the direction in which I thought the face had gone. But there was nothing to be seen, nothing but the broad paths, the tall, dark evergreen hedges, the tossing water of the fountains, and the smooth pool below. I fell back upon the seat and recalled the face I had seen. Strange to say, now that the first impression had passed, there was nothing startling in the recollection. On the contrary, I felt that I was fascinated by the face, and would give anything to see it again. I could retrace the beautiful straight features, the long dark eyes, and the wonderful mouth most exactly in my mind, and when I had reconstructed every detail from memory, I knew that the whole was beautiful, and that I should love a woman with such a face. I wonder whether she is the woman of the water, I said to myself. Then, rising once more, I wandered down the garden, descending one short flight of steps after another, from terrace to terrace by the edge of the marble basins, through the shadow and through the moonlight, and I crossed the water by the rustic bridge above the artificial grotto, and climbed slowly again to the highest terrace by the other side. The air seemed sweeter, and I was very calm, so that I think I smiled to myself as I walked, as though a new happiness had come to me. The woman's face seemed always before me, and the thought of it gave me an unwonted thrill of pleasure, unlike anything I had felt ever before. I turned as I reached the house, and looked back upon the scene. It had certainly changed in the short hour since I had come out, and my mood had changed with it. Just like my luck, I thought, to fall in love with a ghost. But in old times I would have sighed, and gone to bed more sad than ever at such a melancholy conclusion. To-night I felt happy, almost for the first time in my life. The gloomy old study seemed cheerful when I went in. The old pictures on the wall smiled at me, and I sat down in my deep chair with a new and delightful sensation that I was not alone. The idea of having seen a ghost and of feeling much the better for it was so absurd that I laughed softly as I took up one of the books I had brought with me and began to read. That impression did not wear off. I slept peacefully, and in the morning I threw open my windows to the summer air and looked down at the garden, at the stretches of green, and at the coloured flower beds, at the circling swallows, and at the bright water. A man might make a paradise of this place, I exclaimed, a man and a woman together. From that day the old castle no longer seemed gloomy, and I think I ceased to be sad. For some time, too, I began to take an interest in the place and to try and make it more alive. I avoided my old Welsh nurse, lest she should damp my humour with some dismal prophecy, and recall my old self by bringing back memories of my dismal childhood. But what I thought of most was the ghostly figure I had seen in the garden that first night after my arrival. I went out every evening and wandered through the walks and paths, but, try as might, I did not see my vision again. At last, after many days, the memory grew more faint, and my old moody nature gradually overcame the temporary sense of lightness I had experienced. The summer turned to autumn, and I grew restless. It began to rain. The dampness pervaded the gardens, and the outer halls smelled musty, like tombs. The grey sky oppressed me intolerably. I left the place as if it was, and went abroad, determined to try anything which might possibly make a second break in the monotonous melancholy from which I suffered. End of section 18. Part 1. International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories, edited by William Patton. Section 19. By the Waters of Paradise, by F. Marion Crawford. Part 2. Most people would be struck by the utter insignificance of the small events which, after the death of my parents, influenced my life and made me unhappy. The gruesome forebodings of a Welsh nurse, which chanced to be realized by an odd coincidence of events, should not seem enough to change the nature of a child and to direct the bent of his character in after years. The little disappointments of schoolboy life, and the somewhat less childish ones of an uneventful and undistinguished academic career, should not have sufficed to turn me out, at 21 years of age, a melancholic, listless idler. Some weakness of my own character may have contributed to the result, but in a greater degree it was due to my having a reputation of bad luck. However, I will not try to analyze the causes of my state, for I should satisfy nobody, least of all myself. Still less will I attempt to explain why I felt a temporary revival of my spirits after my adventure in the garden. It is certain that I was in love with the face I had seen, and that I longed to see it again. that I gave up all hope of a second visitation, grew more sad than ever, packed up my traps, and finally went abroad. But in my dreams I went back to my home, and it always appeared to be sunny and bright, as it had looked on that summer's morning after I'd seen the woman by the fountain. I went to Paris. I went farther, and wandered about Germany. I tried to amuse myself, and I failed miserably. With the aimless whims of an idle and useless man come all sorts of suggestions for good resolutions. One day I made up my mind that I would go and bury myself in a German university for a time, and live simply like a poor student. I started with the intention of going to Leipzig, determining to stay there until some event should direct my life or change my humour or make an end of me altogether. The express train stopped at some station of which I did not know the name. It was dusk on a winter's afternoon, and I peered through the thick glass from my seat. Suddenly another tram came gliding in from the opposite direction and stopped alongside of ours. I looked at the carriage which chanced to be abreast of mine, and idly read the black letters painted on a white board swinging from the brass handrail: Berlin, Cologne, Paris. Then I looked up at the window above. I started violently, and the cold perspiration broke out upon my forehead. In the dim light, not 6 feet from where I sat, I saw the face of a woman, the face I loved, the straight, fine features, the strange eyes, the wonderful mouth, the pale skin. Her head-dress was a dark veil which seemed to be tied about her head and passed over the shoulders under the chin. As I threw down the window and knelt on the cushioned seat, leaning far out to get a better view, a long whistle screamed through the station, followed by a quick series of dull, clanking sounds. Then there was a slight jerk, and my train moved on. Luckily the window was narrow, being the one over the seat, beside the door, or I believe I would have jumped out of it then and there. In an instant the speed increased, and I was being carried swiftly away in the opposite direction from the thing I loved. For a quarter of an hour I lay back in my place, stunned by the suddenness of the apparition. At last one of the two other passengers, a large and gorgeous captain of the white Königsberg cuirassier, steadily but firmly suggested that I might shut my window, as the evening was cold. I did so with an apology, and relapsed into silence. The train ran swiftly on for a long time, and it was already beginning to slacken speed before entering another station, when I roused myself and made a sudden resolution. As the carriage stopped before the brilliantly lighted platform, I seized my belongings, saluted my fellow passengers, and got out, determined to take the first express back to Paris. This time the circumstances of the vision had been so natural that it did not strike me that there was anything unreal about the face, or about the woman to whom it belonged. I did not try to explain to myself how the face and the woman could be travelling by a fast train from Berlin to Paris on a winter's afternoon, when both were in my mind indelibly associated with the moonlight and the fountains in my own English home. I certainly would not have admitted that I had been mistaken in the dusk, attributing to what I had seen a resemblance to my former vision, which did not really exist. There was not the slightest doubt in my mind, and I was positively sure that I had again seen the face I loved. I did not hesitate, and in a few hours I was on my way back to Paris. I could not help reflecting on my ill luck. Wondering as I had been for many months, I might as easily have chanced that I should be travelling in the same train with that woman, instead of going the other way. But my luck was destined to turn for a time. I searched Paris for several days. I dined at the principal hotels. I went to the theatres. I rode in the Bois de Boulogne in the morning, and picked up an acquaintance whom I forced to drive with me in the afternoon. I went to mass at the Mandolin, and I attended the services at the English church. I hung about the Louvre and Notre Dame. I went to Versailles. I spent hours in parading the Rue de Rivoli in the neighborhood of Meurice's Corner, where foreigners pass and repass from morning till night. At last I received an invitation to a reception at the English embassy. I went, and I found that I had thought so long. There she was, sitting by an old lady in grey satin and diamonds, who had a wrinkled but kindly face and keen grey eyes that seemed to take in everything they saw, with very little inclination to give much in return. But I did not notice the chaperon. I saw only the face that had haunted me for months, and, in the excitement of the moment, I walked quickly towards the pair, forgetting such trifles as the necessity for an introduction. She was more beautiful than I had thought, but I never doubted that it was she herself and no other. Vision or no vision before, this was the reality, and I knew it. Twice her hair had been covered. Now at last I saw it, and the added beauty of its magnificence glorified the whole woman. It was rich hair, fine and abundant, golden, with deep ruddy tints in it like red bronze spun fine. There was no ornament in it, not a rose, not a thread of gold, and I felt that it needed nothing to enhance its splendor, nothing but her pale face, her dark, strange eyes, and her heavy eyebrows. I could see that she was slender too, but strong withal, as she sat there, quietly gazing at the moving scene in the midst of the brilliant lights and the hum of perpetual conversation. I recollected the detail of introduction in time, and turned aside to look for my host. I found him at last. I begged him to present me to the two ladies, pointing them out to him at the same time. Yes, by all means, replied His Excellency with a pleasant smile. He evidently had no idea of my name, which was not to be wondered at. "I'm Lord Cairngorm," I observed. "Oh, by all means," answered the ambassador with the same hospitable smile. "Yes, the fact is, I must try and find out who they are. Such lots of people, you know." "Oh, I will present me. I will try and find out for you," said I, laughing. "Ah, yes, so kind of you. Come along," said my host. We threaded the crowd, and in a few minutes we stood before the two ladies. "I'll introduce Lord Cairngorm," he said, then adding quickly to me, "Come and dine tomorrow, won't you?" He glided away with his pleasant smile, and disappeared in the crowd. I sat down beside the beautiful girl, conscious that the eyes of the duenna were upon me. "I think we've been very near meeting before," I remarked, by way of opening the conversation. My companion turned her eyes full upon me with an air of inquiry. She evidently did not recall my face, if she had ever seen me. "Really? I cannot remember," she observed in a low musical voice. "When?" "In the first place, you came down from Berlin by the express 10 days ago. I was going the other way, and our carriages stopped opposite each other. I saw you at the window." "Yes, we came that way, but I do not remember." She hesitated. Secondly, I continued, I was sitting alone in my garden last summer, near the end of July. Do you remember? You must have wandered in there through the park. You came up to the house and looked at me. Was that you? She asked in evident surprise. Then she broke into a laugh. I told everybody I'd seen a ghost. There had never been any Cairngorms in the place since the memory of man. We left the next day, and never heard that you had come here. Indeed, I did not know the castle belonged to you. Where are you staying? I asked. Where? Why, with my aunt, where I always stay. She is your neighbour, since it is you. I beg your pardon, but then, is your aunt Lady Bluebell? I did not quite catch. Don't be afraid. She's amazingly deaf. Yes, she is the relict of my beloved uncle, the 16th or 17th Baron Bluebell. I forget exactly how many of them there have been. And do you know who I am? She laughed, well knowing that I didn't. No, I answered frankly. I have not the least idea. I asked to be introduced because I recognized you. Perhaps you are Miss Bluebell? Considering that you are a neighbor, I will tell you who I am, she answered. No, I am of the tribe of the Bluebells, but my name is Lammas, and I've been given to understand that I was christened Margaret. Being a floral family, they call me Daisy. A dreadful American man once told me that my aunt was a bluebell and that I was a harebell, with 2 L's and an E, because my hair is so thick. I warn you, so that you may avoid making such a bad pun. Do I look like a man who makes puns? I asked, being very conscious of my melancholy face and sad looks. Miss Lammas eyed me critically. No, you have a mournful temperament. I think I can trust you, she answered. Do you think you could communicate to my aunt the fact that you are a Cairngorm and a neighbour? I'm sure she would like to know. I leaned towards the old lady, inflating my lungs for a yell. But Miss Lammas stopped me. That is not of the slightest use, she remarked. You can write it on a bit of paper. She is utterly deaf. I have a pencil, I answered, but I have no paper. Would my cuff do you think? Oh, yes, replied Miss Lammas with alacrity. Men often do that. I wrote on my cuff. Miss Lammas wishes me to explain that I am your neighbour Cairngorm. Then I held out my arm before the old lady's nose. She seemed perfectly accustomed to the proceeding, put up her glasses, read the words, smiled, nodded, and addressed me in the unearthly voice peculiar to people who hear nothing. I knew your grandfather very well, she said. Then she smiled and nodded to me again and to her niece and relapsed into silence. It is all right, remarked Miss Lammas. Aunt Bluebell knows she is deaf and does not so much like the parrot. You see, she knew your grandfather. How odd that we should be neighbours. Why haven't we met before? If you had told me you knew my grandfather when you appeared in the garden, I should not have been the least surprised, I answered irrelevantly. I really thought you were the ghost of the old fountain. How in the world did you come here at that hour? We were a large party, and we went out for a walk. Then we thought we should like to see what your park was like in the moonlight. And so we trespassed. I got separated from the rest and came upon you by accident, just as I was admiring the extremely ghostly look of your house and wondering whether anybody would ever come and live there again. It looks like the castle of Macbeth or a scene from the opera. Do you know anybody here? Hardly so. Do you? No. Aunt Bluebell said it was her duty to come. It is easy for her to go out. She doesn't bear the burden of the conversation. I'm sorry you find it a burden, said I. Shall I go away? Miss Lammas looked at me with a sudden gravity in her beautiful eyes, and there was a sort of hesitation about the lines of her full, soft mouth. No, she said at last, quite simply, don't go away. We may like each other if you stay a little longer, and we ought to, because we are neighbours in the country. I suppose I ought to have thought Miss Lammas a very odd girl. There is, indeed, a sort of freemasonry between people who discover that they live near each other and that they ought to have known each other before. But there was a sort of unexpected frankness and simplicity in the girl's amusing manner which would have struck anyone else as being singular, to say the least of it. To me, however, it all seemed natural enough. I had dreamed of her face too long not to be utterly happy when I met her at last and could talk to her as much as I pleased. To me, the man of ill luck in everything, the whole meeting seemed too good to be true. I felt again that strange sensation of lightness which I had experienced after I had seen her face in the garden. The great rooms seemed brighter. Life seemed worth living, and my sluggish, melancholy blood ran faster and filled me with a new sense of strength. I said to myself that without this woman I was but an imperfect being, but that with her I could accomplish everything to which I should set my hand. Like the dear doctor, when he thought he had cheated Mephistopheles at last, I could have cried aloud to the fleeting moment, Verfällt doch, du bist so schön. Are you always gay? I asked suddenly. How happy you must be. The days would sometimes seem very long if I were gloomy, she answered thoughtfully. Yes, I think I find life very pleasant, and I tell it so. How can you tell life anything? I inquired. If I could catch my life and talk to it, I would abuse it prodigiously, I assure you. I dare say you have a melancholy temper. You ought to live out of doors, dig potatoes, make hay, shoot, hunt, tumble into ditches, and come home muddy and hungry for dinner. It would be much better for you than moping in your rook tower and hating everything. It is rather lonely down there, I murmured apologetically, feeling that Miss Lammas was quite right. Then marry and quarrel with your wife, she laughed. Anything is better than being alone. I am a very peaceable person. I never quarrel with anybody. You can try it. You will find it quite impossible. Will you let me try? She asked, still smiling. By all means, especially if it is to be only a preliminary canter, I answered rashly. What do you mean? She inquired, turning quickly to me. Oh, nothing. You might try my paces with a view to quarrelling in the future. I cannot imagine how you are going to do it. You will have to resort to immediate and direct abuse. No, I will only say that if you do not like your life, it is your own fault. How can a man of your age talk of being melancholy, or of the hollowness of existence? Are you consumptive? Are you subject to hereditary insanity? Are you deaf, like Anne Bluebell? Are you poor, like lots of people? Have you been crossed in love? Have you lost the world for a woman, or any particular woman, for the sake of the world? Are you feeble-minded, a cripple, an outcast? Are you repulsively ugly? She laughed again. Is there any reason in the world why you should not enjoy all you have got in life? No, there is no reason whatever, except that I am dreadfully unlucky, especially in small things. Then Try big things just for a change, suggested Miss Lammas. Try and get married, for instance, and how it turns out. If I turn out badly, it would be rather serious. Not half so serious as it is to abuse everything unreasonably. If abuse is your particular talent, abuse something that ought to be abused. Abuse the Conservatives or the Liberals. It doesn't matter which, since they're always abusing each other. Make yourself felt by other people. You will like it. If they don't, it will make a man of you. Fill your mouth with pebbles and howl at the sea if you cannot do anything else. It did Demosthenes no end of good, you know. You will have the satisfaction of imitating a great man. Really, Miss Lammas, I think the list of innocent exercises you propose. Very well. If she don't care for that sort of thing, care for some other sort of thing. Care for something, or hate something. Don't be idle. Life is short, and though art may be long, plenty of noise answers nearly as well. I do care for something, I mean somebody, I said. A woman? Then marry her, don't hesitate. I do not know whether she would marry me, I replied. I have never asked her. Then ask her at once, answered Miss Lammas. I shall die happy if I feel I have persuaded a melancholy fellow creature to rouse himself to action. Ask her by all means, and see what she says. If she does not accept you at once, she might take you the next time. Meanwhile, you will have entered for the race. If you lose, there are the old-aged trial stakes and the consolation race, and plenty of selling races in the bargain. Shall I take you at your word, Miss Lammas? I hope you will, she answered. Since you yourself advise me, I will. Miss Lammas, will you do me the honor to marry me? For the first time in my life, the blood rushed to my head, and my sight swam. I cannot tell why I said it. It would be useless to try to explain the extraordinary fascination the girl exercised over me, or the still more extraordinary feeling of intimacy with her which had grown in me during that half hour. Lonely, sad, unlucky as I had been all my life, I was certainly not timid, nor even shy, but to propose to marry a woman after half an hour's acquaintance was a piece of madness of which I never believed myself capable, and of which I should never be capable again, could I be placed in the same situation. It was as though my whole being had been changed in a moment by magic, by the white magic of her nature brought into contact with mine. The blood sank back to my heart, and a moment later I found myself staring at her with anxious eyes. To my amazement, she was as calm as ever, but her beautiful mouth smiled, and there was a mischievous light in her dark brown eyes. Fairly caught, she answered. But for an individual who pretends to be listless and sad, you are not lacking in humour. I had really not the least idea what you were going to say. Wouldn't it be singularly awkward for you if I had said yes? I never saw anybody begin to practise so sharply what was preached to him, with so very little loss of time. You probably never met a man who had dreamed of you for 7 months before being introduced. No, I never did, she answered gaily. It smacks of the romantic. Perhaps you are a romantic character, after all. I should think you were if I believed you. Very well, you've taken my advice. Entered for a stranger's race and lost it. Try the old-aged trial stakes. You have another cuff and a pencil. Propose to Aunt Bluebell. She would dance with astonishment, and she might recover her hearing. End of section 19. This recording is in the public domain. International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. International Short Stories, Volume 1, American Stories, edited by William Patton. Section 20. By the Waters of Paradise by F. Marion Crawford. Part 3. That was how I first asked Margaret Lammas to be my wife, and I will agree with anyone who says I behaved very foolishly. But I have not repented of it, and I never shall. I have long ago understood that I was out of my mind that evening, but I think that my temporary insanity on that occasion has had the effect of making me a saner man ever since. Her manner turned my head, for it was so different from what I had expected. To hear this lovely creature, who in my imagination was the heroine of romance, if not of tragedy, talking familiarly and laughing readily, was more than my equanimity could bear, and I lost my head as well as my heart. But when I went back to England in the spring, I went to make certain arrangements at the castle, certain changes and improvements which would be absolutely necessary. I had won the race for which I had entered myself so rashly, and we were to be married in June. Whether the change was due to the orders I had left with the gardener and the rest of the servants, or to my own state of mind, I cannot tell. At all events, the old place did not look the same to me when I opened my window on the morning after my arrival. There were the grey walls below me, and the grey turrets flanking the huge building. There were the fountains, the marble causeways, the smooth basins, the tall box edges, the water lilies, and the swan, just as of old. But there was something else there, too, something in the air, in the water, and in the greenness that I did not recognize, a light over everything by which everything was transfigured. The clock in the tower struck E7, and the strokes of the ancient bell sounded like a wedding chime. The air sang with the thrilling treble of the songbirds, with the silvery music of the splashing water, and the softer harmony of the leaves stirred by the fresh morning wind. There was a smell of new-mown hay from the distant meadows, and of blooming roses from the beds below, wafted up together to my window. I stood in the pure sunshine, and drank the air and all the sounds and the odours that were in it, and I looked down at my garden and said, "It is paradise after all." I think the men of old were right when they called heaven a garden, and Eden a garden inhabited by one man and one woman, the earthly paradise. I turned away, wondering what had become of the gloomy memories I had always associated with my home. I tried to recall the impression of my nurse's horrible prophecy before the death of my parents, an impression which hitherto had been vivid enough. I tried to remember my old self, my dejection, my listlessness, my bad luck, my petty disappointments. I endeavored to force myself to think as I used to think, if only to satisfy myself that I had not lost my individuality. But I succeeded in none of these efforts. I was a different man, a changed being, incapable of sorrow, of ill luck, or of sadness. My life had been a dream, not evil, but infinitely gloomy and hopeless. It was now a reality, full of hope, gladness, and all manner of good. My home had been like a tomb. To-day it was paradise. My heart had been as though it had not existed. Today it beat with strength and youth and the certainty of realized happiness. I revelled in the beauty of the world, and called loveliness out of the future to enjoy it before time should bring it to me, as a traveller in the plains looks up to the mountains and already tastes the cool air through the dust of the road. Here, I thought, we'll live and live for years. There we will sit by the fountains towards evening, and in the deep moonlight. Down those paths we will wander together. On those benches we will rest and talk. Among those eastern hills we will ride through the soft twilight, and in the old house we will tell tales on winter nights when the logs burn high and the holly berries are red, and the old clock tolls out the dying year. On these old steps, in these dark passages and stately rooms, there will one day be the sound of little pattering feet, and laughing child voices will ring up to the vaults of the ancient hall. Those tiny footsteps shall not be slow and sad as mine were, nor shall the childish words be spoken in an awed whisper. No gloomy Welshwoman shall people the dusky corners with weird horrors, no utter horrid prophecies of death and ghastly things. All shall be young and fresh and joyful and happy, and we will turn the old luck again, and forget that there was ever any sadness. So I thought, as I looked out of my window that morning, and for many mornings after that, and every day it all seemed more real than ever before, and much nearer. But the old nurse looked at me askance, and muttered odd sayings about the woman of the water. I cared little what she said, because I was far too happy. At last the time came near for the wedding. Lady Bluebell and all a tribe of Bluebells, as Margaret called them, were at the Bluebell Grange, for we had determined to be married in the country, and to come straight to the castle afterwards. We cared little for travelling, and not at all for a crowded ceremony at St. George's in Hanover Square, with all the tiresome formalities afterwards. I used to ride over to the Grange every day, and very often Margaret would come with her aunt and some of the consuls to the castle. I was suspicious of my own taste, and was only too glad to let her have her way about the alterations and improvements in our home. We were to be married on the 30th of July, and on the evening of the 28th Margaret drove over with some of the Bluebell party. In the long summer twilight we all went out into the garden. Naturally enough, Margaret and I were left to ourselves, and we wandered down by the marble basins. "It is an odd coincidence," I said. "It was on this very night last year that I first saw you." "Considering that it is the month of July," answered Margaret with a laugh, "and that we have been here almost every day, I don't think the coincidence is so extraordinary after all." "No, dear," said I, "I suppose not. I don't know why it struck me. We shall very likely be here a year from to-day, and a year from that. The odd thing, when I think of it, is that you should be here at all. But my luck has turned. I ought not to think anything odd that happens, now that I have you. It is all sure to be good." "A slight change in your ideas since that remarkable performance of yours in Paris," said Margaret. "Do you know, I thought you were the most extraordinary man I'd ever met." "I thought you were the most charming woman I'd ever seen. I naturally did not want to lose any time in frivolities. I took you at your word, I followed your advice, I asked you to marry me, and this is the delightful result. What's the matter?" Margaret had started suddenly, and her hand tightened on my arm. An old woman was coming up the path, and was close to us before we saw her, for the moon had risen and was shining full in our faces. The woman turned out to be my old nurse. "It's only Judith, dear. Don't be frightened," I said. Then I spoke to the Welshwoman. "What are you about, Judith? Have you been feeding the woman of the water?" "Ah, when the clock strikes, Willie, my lord, I mean," muttered the old creature, drawing aside to let us pass, and fixing her strange eyes on Margaret's face. "What does she mean?" asked Margaret when we had gone by. "Nothing, darling. The old thing is mildly crazy, but she is a good soul." We went on in silence for a few moments, and came to the rustic bridge just above the artificial grotto, through which the water ran out into the park, dark and swift in its narrow channel. We stopped and leaned on the wooden rail. The moon was now behind us, and shone full upon the long vista of basins and on the huge walls and towers of the castle above. "How proud you ought to be of such a grand old place," said Margaret softly. "It is yours now, darling," I answered. "You have as good a right to love it as I, but I only love it because you are to live in it, dear." Her hand stole out and lay mine, and we were both silent. Just then the clock began to strike far off in the tower. I counted 8, 9, 10, 11. I looked at my watch. 12, 13. I laughed. The bell went on striking. "The old clock has gone crazy like Judith," I explained. Still it went on, note after note, ringing out monotonously through the still air. We leaned over the rail, instinctively looking in the direction whence the sound came. On and on it went. I counted nearly 100, out of sheer curiosity, for I understood that something had broken, and that the thing was running itself down. Suddenly there was a crack as of breaking wood, a cry, and a heavy splash, and I was alone, clinging to the broken end of the rail of the rustic bridge. I do not think I hesitated while my pulse beat twice. I sprang clear of the bridge into the black rushing water, dived to the bottom, came up again with empty hands, turned and swam downward through the grotto in the thick darkness, plunging and diving at every stroke, striking my head and hands against jagged stones and sharp corners, clutching at last something in my fingers, and dragging it up with all my might. I spoke. I cried aloud, but there was no answer. I was alone in the pitchy darkness with my burden, and the house was 500 yards away. Struggling still, I felt the ground beneath my feet. I saw a ray of moonlight. The grotto widened, and the deep water became a broad and shallow brook as I stumbled over the stones, and at last laid Margaret's body on the bank in the park beyond. Willie, as the clock struck," said the voice of Judith, the Welsh nurse, as she bent down and looked at the white face. The old woman must have turned back and followed us, seen the accident, and slipped out by the lower gate of the garden. "Eh," she groaned, "you have fed the woman of the water this night, Willie, while the clock was striking." I scarcely heard her as I knelt beside the lifeless body of the woman I loved, chafing the wet white temples, and gazing wildly into the wide staring eyes. I remember only the first returning look of consciousness, the first heaving breath, the first movement of those dear hands stretching out towards me. That is not much of a story, you say. It is the story of my life, that is all. It does not pretend to be anything else. Old Judith says my luck turned on that summer's night when I was struggling in the water to save all that was worth living for. A month later there was a stone bridge over the grotto, and Margaret and I stood on it and looked up at the moonlight castle as we had done once before, and as we have done many times since. For all those things happened 10 years ago, last summer, and this is the 10th Christmas Eve we've spent together by the roaring logs in the old hall, talking of old times. And every year there are more old times to talk of. There are curly-headed boys, too, with red gold hair and dark brown eyes, like their mothers, and a little Margaret, with solemn black eyes like mine. Why could she not look like her mother, too, as well as the rest of them? The world is very bright at this glorious Christmas time, and perhaps there is little use in calling up the sadness of long ago, unless it be to make the jolly firelight seem more cheerful, the good wife's face look gladder, and to give the children's laughter a merrier ring, by contrast with all that is gone. Perhaps, too, some sad-faced, listless, melancholy youth, who feels that the world is very hollow, and that life is like a perpetual funeral service, just as I used to feel myself, may take courage from my example, and, having found the woman of his heart, ask her to marry him after half an hour's acquaintance. But, on the whole, I would not advise any man to marry, for the simple reason that no man will ever find a wife like mine, and being obliged to do farther, he will necessarily fare worse. My wife has done miracles, but I will not assert that any other woman is able to follow her example. Margaret always said that the old place was beautiful, and that I ought to be proud of it. I dare say she is right. She has even more imagination than I, but I have a good answer, and a plain one, which is this, that all the beauty of the castles comes from her. She has breathed upon it all, as the children blow upon the cold glass window panes in winter, and as their warm breath crystallizes into landscapes from fairyland, full of exquisite shapes and traceries upon the blank surface, so her spirit has transformed every grey stone of the old towers, every ancient tree and hedge in the gardens, every thought in my once melancholy self. All that was old is young, and all that was sad is glad, and I am the gladdest of all. Whatever heaven may be, there is no earthly paradise without movement, nor is there anywhere a place so desolate, so dreary, so unutterably miserable, that a woman cannot make it seem heaven to the man she loves and who loves her. I hear certain cynics laugh, and cry that all that has been said before. Do not laugh, my good cynic. You are too small a man to laugh at such a great thing as love. Prayers have been said before now by many, and perhaps you say yours too. I do not think they lose anything by being repeated, nor you by repeating them. You say that the world is bitter, and full of the waters of bitterness. Love, and so live that you may be loved. The world will turn sweet for you, and you shall rest like me by the waters of paradise. End of section 20.